Tonight, before anything else, picture a small stone city on the edge of a wide blue bay, and picture it early in the morning, before the heat, in the last summer it would ever know. It is a little before dawn on an ordinary day, more than 1900 years ago, and the city has not yet learned that it is going to become the most famous small city in the history of the world. The name of the place is Pompeii. It sits on a low shelf of old grey rock, a little way back from the sea, with the water on one side of it, and on the other side, a green and gentle mountain that everyone in the city has looked at every single day of their lives, without once being afraid of it. The mountain is called Vesuvius. On this morning it is simply a shape on the skyline, wooded near the top, planted with vines lower down, the same soft blue-green it has always been. No one looks at it twice. In the streets below, the city is beginning to stir in the slow, unhurried way that cities stir before the sun is fully up. A baker somewhere near the Forum has been awake for hours already, because bakers are always awake for hours already, and the smell of the first loaves is moving down a narrow lane between high plastered walls, warm and yeasty and comforting, the way that smell has been comforting people for as long as there has been bread. A cart goes by on the stone road with a sound like slow thunder, its iron-shod wheels dropping into the deep ruts worn by 100 years of other carts. A dog stretches in a doorway, a shutter opens somewhere above the street, and a woman leans out into the cool grey air and looks up at the sky, and the sky tells her nothing at all, because the sky is clear and pale and perfectly calm, the way it usually is on the bay in the last warm weeks of the year. She goes back inside. The fountains at the street corners run and run, as they always run, the water sliding over the worn lip of the stone basin, and a boy fills a jug and carries it home, with both arms wrapped around it. This is the whole of it. This is a morning like 10,000 mornings before it. Bread, and water, and carts, and the mountain sitting quiet and green on the edge of everything, holding its breath in a way that no one has any reason to notice. That is where we are going to begin tonight, and I am asking you, very gently, not to hurry ahead of the story, because the whole point of the story is that no one in it knew what was coming, and for a long while, in the telling of it, neither will we. We are simply going to walk into this small, bright city and stay in it, and let the day be an ordinary day, for as long as it can be. So let us settle in. Let this be the moment you set the day down. Whatever you have been carrying since this morning, the small worries and the large ones, the things you meant to do and did not do, the things someone said and the things you wish you had said back, let them go quiet now, one at a time, the way lamps go quiet when the oil runs low. There is nothing left tonight that needs solving. There is nothing on the other side of this hour that cannot wait until the morning. Let the lamp beside you grow dim in your mind. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have crept up to. Let the weight of the whole long day slide slowly down and off, one quiet inch at a time, until you are no longer holding anything at all. If you find, as the story goes on, that these old walls and quiet streets are helping you drift, then it would mean a great deal to me if you would gently tap the like button, and perhaps subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, only if these long, slow nights are of some use to you. And if you have a moment before your eyes close, leave your town and your local time down in the comments. I love reading them. It is a strange and lovely thing, in the small hours, to see one sleepless person in one country and another on the far side of the world, both awake, both here, both listening to the same quiet voice tell the same old story. And it helps other people who cannot sleep to find their way to this quiet place and settle in beside you. So tell me where you are. Then let your eyes rest. You do not need to follow every name or every date. The names and the dates will wash over you like water over stone, and that is exactly as it should be, because this is not a lesson and there will be no test in the morning. This is only a long, slow walk through a city that once was told softly, so that you can fall asleep somewhere along the way and leave the rest of us to keep walking without you. Now, to understand Pompeii, to really understand this small city on its shelf of grey rock, we have to do something that seems, at first, like going backwards. We have to leave the morning behind for a while, that ordinary morning with the bread and the carts, and we have to travel back, far further back, to a time long before there was a Pompeii at all, before there were streets to walk on or walls to shelter behind, before anyone had thought to give the Green Mountain a name or to plant vines on its warm and generous slopes, because a city is never really the beginning of its own story. A city is the middle of a story that the land was already telling long before the first person arrived, and the land around this particular bay had been telling its story patiently for a very long time indeed. So let us go back. Let us go back to the bay itself, before the ships, before the harbours, before the smoke of anyone's cooking fire rose into the evening air. Let us go back to when the mountain was younger and the shoreline had a different shape, and there was no one at all to watch the sun come up over the water. The bay we now call the Bay of Naples is one of the loveliest curves of coastline anywhere in the world, and it has always been so. A wide blue crescent of calm water sheltered from the open sea, ringed by soft green hills, and at its heart the single great cone of the mountain rising up out of the flat coastal plain, like something set down there on purpose. To the people who would eventually live around it, the bay was a kind of gift. The soil was extraordinary. It was dark and deep and unbelievably fertile. The kind of soil in which almost anything will grow if you simply put it in the ground and stand back. And the reason for that richness, the deep secret underneath all that abundance, was the very mountain that made the whole place so beautiful. For the soil of that plain was volcanic soil, laid down over uncounted ages by the mountain itself, and a volcano over the long slow centuries is one of the most generous things in nature, and also one of the most patient. It gives, and it gives, and it gives, spreading its ash across the land in thin gentle layers that break down into the richest farmland imaginable, and then, once in a great while, once in a span of time so long that no single human life could ever hold both ends of it, it asks for something back. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and I promised we would not hurry. On this morning, and for the whole long stretch of centuries that we are about to walk through, the mountain is only giving. The vines on its lower slopes grow heavy with grapes that make a wine famous all along the coast. The lower fields grow grain and beans and cabbages and onions, olives on the drier ground, fruit trees heavy in their season, and everything grows better here than it has any right to grow. Because of the mountain, because of the long, slow generosity of the mountain, because of the thin grey ash of 1,000 forgotten years worked down into the earth beneath the farmer's feet. So the people came. Of course they came. People always come to good soil the way water comes to low ground, steadily, and from every direction, and long before there was anything you could call a city, there were people living on that shelf of rock above the sea, drawn there by the same three things that draw people everywhere and always have. There was safe high ground to build on, there was fresh water to drink, and there was land so rich that a family could feed itself and have enough left over to trade. And where there is enough left over to trade, a village will always, sooner or later, begin to dream of becoming a town. The first people we can really speak of, the first who left enough behind them that we can say with some confidence that they were there, were a people called the Oscans, and the Oscans were an old people even by the standards of that old land. They spoke their own language, which was not Latin and not Greek, but something older and more local, a rough and rooted tongue of the Italian countryside, and they lived in scattered settlements across the plain and the hills, farming and herding and trading in a small way. And it was the Oscans, most likely, who first gathered on that shelf of grey rock above the river mouth and decided that this was a good place to stay. The very name of the city, Pompeii, seems to reach back to them and to their language, and though people have argued about it for centuries, one of the gentlest and most likely explanations is that the name comes from an old Oscan word for the number 5, as though the town had begun as 5 small villages that had slowly grown together into one. 5 hamlets on 5 low rises leaning toward each other over the generations until they touched and became a single thing with a single name. Whether that is exactly true or only a lovely idea, no one can now say for certain, and it is the kind of thing that hardly matters when you are trying to fall asleep. So let it be as true as you like. What matters is that people were there, on that rock, above that river, in the shadow of that green and quiet mountain, a very long time before anyone thought to write anything down, and that the place already had the shape of the place it would become. The rock they built on was not just any rock. It was an old flow of hardened lava, a broad low tongue of stone that some far more ancient eruption had sent creeping down toward the sea in an age before all memory, and it had cooled there and hardened into a firm flat shelf standing a little above the surrounding plain, with the land dropping away on its southern and western sides toward the river and the water, and that to a people who had to think about safety before they thought about anything else, was close to perfect. High ground is defensible ground. A town on a shelf of rock can see its enemies coming across the flat land, and can build its walls along the natural edge of the height, and can sleep a little easier at night for all of that. The river gave them a harbour, or something close to a harbour, a place where small ships could come up from the sea and tie off and unload, which meant trade, and trade meant wealth, and so from very early on Pompeii was not only a farming town, but a trading town, a place where the goods of the rich inland fields came down to meet the goods that came in by sea, and where both changed hands and left a little of their value behind in the town every time they did. That is the deep foundation of the whole story, and it is worth resting on for a moment, because everything that Pompeii ever became grew up out of those 2 simple facts. It had the richest farmland in Italy at its back, and it had the sea at its feet. A town with one of those things can do well. A town with both of them can hardly help becoming rich, and Pompeii over the long centuries became rich in exactly the slow and steady way that such towns do, not through some single stroke of fortune, but through 1,000 ordinary years of grain and wine and oil and fish and wool, moving patiently through its gates and down to its little harbour and out across the bright water of the bay. But the Oscans were not to have the place to themselves, because good ground never belongs to only one people for very long. The bay was too beautiful and too rich, and word of such places always travels. And so, while the Oscans were still working their fields on the plain, other people began to arrive by sea, and the first of these, the first of the great seafaring peoples to take an interest in that lovely curve of coast, were the Greeks. The Greeks in those days were the great sailors and colonists of the Mediterranean world, restless and clever and endlessly curious, forever loading their ships and setting out from their crowded homeland to plant new cities on distant shores, and they had come west across the sea, and found the coast of southern Italy so much to their liking that they settled it thickly, so thickly that the whole region came in time to be called by a name that meant Great Greece. They founded a great city just up the coast, on the far side of the bay, and it was that city, in the end, that would give its name to the whole region, for its name was Neapolis, the new city, and it is with us still, worn down by the centuries into the single soft word Naples. The Greeks did not so much conquer the little Oscan towns of the plain as lean on them, trade with them, marry into them, and leave their fingerprints all over them. They brought their gods and their letters, and their way of building temples with tall fluted columns and clean stone steps, and their love of the theatre, and their coins, and their wine cups painted with black figures on red clay, and the small towns of the plain, Pompeii among them, soaked all of this up the way a sponge soaks up water, keeping their own old Oscan speech and their own old ways, but layering over them a bright Greek varnish of art and trade and civic pride. If you had walked through Pompeii in those early centuries, you would have found a town that was Oscan in its bones and Greek in its manners, worshipping at temples built in the Greek style, using the Greek alphabet to scratch the odd word onto a wall, drinking wine from cups a Greek potter would have recognized, and yet still, underneath it all, speaking that rough old local tongue among themselves at the end of the day. And there was a third people too, who pressed down from the north and left their own mark for a while. A people called the Etruscans, who were the great power of central Italy in those years, before Rome was anything more than a cluster of villages on some muddy hills beside a river. The Etruscans were a mysterious people, and they remain mysterious to us even now, because their language has never been fully understood, and so much of what they were has come down to us only through the eyes of the people who eventually overcame them. But in their day they were mighty, and they spread their power south into the region of the bay, and for a while Pompeii sat within their orbit as well, taking a little of their influence too. A little more richness layered onto an already rich mixture, so that the town became a kind of meeting place of peoples, Oscan and Greek and Etruscan all at once, none of them quite in charge, all of them leaving something behind. And this really was the making of Pompeii, this slow blending over centuries of everyone who came to the bay. It never became purely one thing. It was always a mixture, a crossroads, a place where the inland farmers met the seagoing traders and where the local tongue met the languages of half the Mediterranean. And that mixed and open character stayed with the town right to the very end, so that even in its last days, more than 1900 years ago, you could still find in Pompeii the layered traces of all the peoples who had passed through it and shaped it and moved on. But the Etruscan power did not last. Nothing did, on that plain, for very long, and in time the Etruscans faded, pushed back and worn down, and a new people came to dominate the region. A fierce and hardy people from the high mountains of the interior, a people of shepherds and warriors called the Samnites. The Samnites came down out of their mountains in wave after wave, hungry for the rich lowland and the good ground, and they took the towns of the plain one by one, and among the towns they took was Pompeii. And unlike the Greeks, who had leaned and traded and married, and unlike the Etruscans, who had held the place loosely from a distance, the Samnites came to stay. They moved in. They took the town as their own, and it was under the Samnites, in the long centuries that followed, that Pompeii truly became a city, a real city, with real walls and real streets laid out on a plan, a proper civic heart, and the beginnings of the shape that the ruins still hold today. So it is to the Samnite town that we must go next, the town of walls and gates and the first great public spaces, because it was the Samnites who drew, in the soft ground of that shelf of rock, the outline that everything else would grow to fill. The Samnite town grew slowly, the way towns did in those days, one wall at a time, one street at a time, one lifetime laid patiently on top of the last. The Samnites ringed the whole shelf of rock with a great circuit of stone walls, more than 1.5 miles of them, running all the way around the town along the natural edge of the height, with gates set into them where the roads came in from the countryside, and towers standing up at intervals along their length. These were serious walls, built by people who knew what it was to be attacked, thick and high and faced with squared blocks of pale stone, and they enclosed a space large enough to hold everything the town would ever need to be, so that in all the centuries that followed, the town never had to burst its walls and spill out across the plain the way some cities do. It simply grew denser and richer inside the boundary the Samnites had drawn, filling in the empty ground within the walls with houses and workshops and temples and gardens, until every corner of the enclosed shelf was busy with life. And within those walls the Samnites laid out the streets, and here we come to one of the quietly remarkable things about Pompeii, which is how sensibly, how thoughtfully, the old town was planned. The main streets ran straight and true, crossing one another at generous right angles, dividing the town into blocks, and though the very oldest heart of the town, down near the Forum, kept the tangled, winding, higgledy shape of its earliest days, the newer districts spread out from it in a clean and orderly grid that would not look out of place in a modern town. The streets were paved with great blocks of hard grey volcanic stone, fitted together and worn over the years into the deep smooth ruts that the cartwheels had ground into them, and raised stone pavements ran along either side for people on foot, lifted up above the roadway so that walkers could keep their feet dry when the streets ran with rainwater or with the overflow of the fountains. And at the crossings, set into the road itself, were the stepping stones, big flat blocks of stone standing up above the surface of the street, spaced just so that a person could cross from one pavement to the other without stepping down into the wet and the filth of the roadway, while the gaps between the stones were spaced just wide enough for the wheels of the carts to pass through. It is such a small and human thing, those stepping stones, and yet when you understand them, you understand something about the people who made them, that they thought about the ordinary business of getting through a rainy day with dry feet, that they solved it cleverly and permanently in stone, and that the very same stones are still there today, still standing up out of the very same streets, still worn smooth on top by the feet of people who have been dust for the better part of 2,000 years. At the heart of the town lay the Forum, the great open public square that was the beating centre of any Roman or Italian town, and even under the Samnites this space was already the focus of everything, the place where the temples stood and the markets were held and the business of the town was done. And rising over the northern end of the Forum, framed against the sky, was the mountain, always the mountain, green and quiet and close, so that a person standing in the middle of the town, in the middle of the busy square, buying fish or arguing about the price of wool, had only to lift their eyes to see Vesuvius standing there at the end of the street, as familiar and as unremarkable as the sky itself. Now, all this while, off to the north, on those muddy hills beside their river, a small and stubborn city had been growing into something formidable, and its name, of course, was Rome. Rome in those centuries was on the long, hard, patient climb that would eventually make it the master of the whole known world, and as it climbed it reached out, further and further, swallowing its neighbours one by one, and in time its hungry gaze fell upon the rich lands of the south, upon great Greece, and upon the Samnites, and upon all the towns of that lovely bay. There followed long and bitter wars between Rome and the Samnites, wars fought up and down the mountains and across the plains for the better part of 100 years, and in the end, as nearly everyone did in the end, the Samnites lost, and their towns, Pompeii among them, passed under the power of Rome. But it was a strange kind of belonging at first. Pompeii was not conquered and destroyed and rebuilt as a Roman town. It became instead what the Romans called an allied town, a town bound to Rome by treaty, keeping its own local government and its own Samnite language and its own old ways, but obliged to send soldiers to fight in Rome's wars, and folded, whether it liked it or not, into the vast and growing web of Roman power. And for a long while that arrangement held, and Pompeii went on much as before, Oscan in its speech, and Samnite in its bones, and now Roman in its allegiance, growing steadily richer on its wine and its oil and its trade, a prosperous allied town on the edge of a great and expanding empire. But the arrangement carried inside it a deep and simmering resentment, because the allied towns of Italy did all the things that Roman citizens did, paid the taxes and fought the wars and shed the blood, and yet they were not Roman citizens, and did not have the rights and the voice and the standing that came with that name, and over the years that resentment grew and hardened until at last, a little less than a century before the end, it boiled over into a terrible war. A war of the Allies against Rome itself, in which the towns of Italy rose up together and demanded, with swords in their hands, the citizenship they had been so long denied. Pompeii took part in that great uprising, and for its trouble it drew the attention of one of the most formidable and pitiless soldiers Rome ever produced, a general named Sulla, who marched south with an army and laid siege to the town. You can still see the marks of that siege on the old Samnite walls if you know where to look, the scars and gouges left by the great stones flung from Roman siege engines, pockmarks in the ancient stonework, and even, scratched here and there onto the walls in the old Oscan tongue, what seemed to be the hurried directions of the defenders to one another, notes about where to move and where to gather, frozen there in the stone through all the centuries since. The town held out for a while, but towns almost never hold out against a determined Roman army for long, and in the end Pompeii fell. And in the aftermath, Sulla did the thing that finally and completely made Pompeii Roman, more thoroughly Roman than any treaty ever could. He settled a great body of his own veteran soldiers in the town, several thousand hard old campaigners and their families, planted down among the existing population as a Roman colony, And from that moment Pompeii was, in the fullest sense, a Roman town. Latin became the language of the streets. Roman law became the law of the place. The old Samnite families and the new Roman settlers mixed and married and, over a generation or two, blended into a single population, and the town took on, at last, the full shape and character it would carry to the end. A bustling, prosperous, thoroughly Roman city, on the sunny shore of the loveliest bay in Italy, with the whole vast strength of the empire behind it, and the whole rich abundance of the plain around it, and the green mountain as ever, standing quiet and close at the end of every street. Let us walk, then, into the Roman city at its height, in the years of its greatest prosperity, and let us begin where the whole town began and where its heart always lay, in the Forum. Imagine a long open rectangle of paved ground, larger than you might expect, floored in great slabs of gleaming pale stone, ringed on every side by tall columns and grand public buildings, and closed to wheeled traffic, so that it was a space for people and not for carts, a place to walk and gather and talk. At the northern end, raised up on a high platform and reached by a broad flight of steps, stood the most important temple in the city, the great temple of Jupiter, the king of the gods, and behind it, framing it, filling the whole northern sky at the end of the square, rose the green cone of Vesuvius, so that the god and the mountains stood together at the head of the Forum, the one made by human hands, and the other made by something far older, and no one in all those centuries ever seems to have thought that the arrangement was anything but perfectly natural. Around the other sides of the Forum stood the rest of the machinery of a Roman town's public life. There was the Basilica, the great roofed hall where the courts sat and business was done and legal disputes were argued out, its floor worn by the feet of merchants and magistrates. There were the temples of other gods, and the halls of the town's officials, and a grand covered market for the selling of food, and a building given over to the cloth trade, and here and there, standing on their stone bases around the edges of the square, the statues of emperors and local worthies, bronze and marble figures of the great and the good, looking down on the daily bustle with fixed and patient faces. The Forum was where you came to vote, to worship, to buy, to sell, to hear the news, to see and be seen, to bring a lawsuit or answer one, to honour the gods and the emperor, and to conduct every kind of public business that a busy and prosperous town could generate. And on any ordinary day it would have been crowded from early morning, loud with voices and footsteps and the cries of vendors, warm with the smell of bodies and food and dust, alive in every corner. And all of it, every stone of it, was kept running by something that we take entirely for granted, and that the Romans had raised to a high and beautiful art. And that thing was water. Pompeii, in its Roman prime, was a town awash in clean running water, and this was no small achievement, because water does not carry itself uphill or across country of its own accord, and a town of some size needs a great deal of it. The Romans solved this the way the Romans solved so many things, with patient engineering on a grand scale. A long aqueduct brought water to the region from sources far away in the hills, and a branch of it ran to Pompeii and delivered its flow to a great distribution tank set at the highest point of the town, near one of the gates. And from that tank the water was divided and sent out through the streets in pipes, mostly pipes of lead, buried beneath the pavements, branching and branching again until they reached every corner of the city. Some of that water went to the public fountains that stood at the street corners, one every block or so, each a simple stone basin with a spout, running day and night, never turned off, where anyone at all, rich or poor, citizen or slave, could come with a jug and take as much clean water as they could carry, free, at any hour. Some of it went to the great public baths which drank water by the bathtub full, and some of it, for those who could pay for the privilege, was piped directly into private houses, into the homes of the wealthy, to feed the fountains and pools of their gardens and the basins of their kitchens, a luxury of astonishing convenience for the ancient world, running water in your own home. at a time when most of humanity for most of its history has had to carry every drop it used from a well or a stream. And that flowing water is a good way to understand the wealth of Pompeii, because a town does not build and maintain such a system unless it has money, and Pompeii had money, a great deal of it, earned and re-earned year after year through trade and farming and craft. The wealth came first and always from the land, from that impossibly rich volcanic soil, and above all it came from wine. The slopes of Vesuvius and the fields of the plain grew grapes in enormous abundance, and the wine of the region was famous and shipped far and wide, out of the little harbour, in tall pottery jars called amphorae, sealed and stamped and stacked in the holds of ships, sailing away across the bay and out into the wider Mediterranean to be drunk in cities the Pompeians would never see. The town made oil from its olives, and shipped that too, and it made one other thing, a thing that the whole Roman world adored, and that Pompeii and its neighbours produced on a great scale, a thing that we might find a little startling but that they could hardly imagine eating without, and that thing was a sauce made from fish. It was called garum, and it was made by taking quantities of fish, and fish guts, and salt, and leaving them to ferment together in the sun for weeks and months in great open vats, until they broke down into a thick, salty, savoury liquid that was then strained off and bottled and sold, and the Romans put it on very nearly everything, the way we might use salt or a strong sauce today, and the best garum fetched high prices, and the making of it, though it must have been an astonishingly smelly business to stand near, made a good number of Pompeians very comfortably rich indeed. So the wealth flowed in, from the wine and the oil and the grain and the fish sauce and the wool and the endless coming and going of trade, and it settled in the town and built the fountains and the temples and the baths and the fine houses, and it turned a prosperous provincial town into something bright and confident and pleased with itself. A town that knew it was doing well and was not shy about showing it. And through it all, feeding the fields and filling the wine jars and making the whole abundant machine possible, ran the deep dark generosity of the volcanic earth, the gift of the mountain, given freely and constantly and without any sign at all, that it would ever be anything other than a gift. Now let us leave the grand public heart of the town and turn down one of the side streets into the ordinary working life of the place, because Pompeii, for all its temples and fountains, was above everything else a town of work, a town of shops and workshops and small businesses crammed into every available frontage, and it is in those small busy rooms that the real texture of daily life is too. Be found. Walk down almost any street and you would have passed one open shop front after another, wide doorways opening directly onto the pavement, their wooden shutters folded back for the day, each one a little world of its own. Here was a bakery, and the bakeries of Pompeii were serious operations, with great millstones of rough grey volcanic stone standing in the back, shaped like giant hourglasses, turned round and round by a donkey or by a man walking in endless circles to grind the grain to flour, and beside them the ovens, round brick domes with a low-arched mouth, exactly the shape of a pizza oven today, because they are the ancestor of the pizza oven today, in which the loaves were baked. When the town was uncovered, the archaeologists found in one of those ovens a batch of loaves that had been put in to bake on the last morning and never taken out, 80 one-round flat loaves, each scored into segments like a wheel so it could be broken apart by hand, carbonized black by the heat but perfectly preserved in their shape, still sitting where the baker had left them, still waiting, after all this time, to be collected by customers who never came. It is one of the small things about Pompeii that stays with a person, that batch of bread, and we will come back to the reason for it in its proper place. But for now let it simply stand as a picture of an ordinary working morning, of loaves going into an oven, of the whole small honest business of feeding a town, going on exactly as it had gone on every day for 100 years. Next to the baker perhaps was a fuller, and the fullers were the launderers and cloth finishers of the ancient world, and theirs too was a smelly trade, because the way you cleaned and thickened woolen cloth in those days was to tread it, underfoot, in vats of water mixed with a kind of natural cleaning agent, and the cleaning agent they favoured, cheap and plentiful and surprisingly effective, was stale human urine, which was collected in pots left out on the street corners for the purpose and carried to the fullers' workshops to be used. So the fullers stood in their vats and trod the cloth clean, and then rinsed it and dried it and brushed it and pressed it, and turned out the fine white woolen goods that clothed the town, and grew prosperous doing it, prosperous enough that one of the great fulling establishments of Pompeii was among the grander buildings of its district, and its owners proud enough to have themselves commemorated in it. And scattered all along the streets, on nearly every block, at a density that would put a modern city to shame, were the bars, the little eating and drinking houses where ordinary people bought their hot food and their cups of wine, and these are so common in the ruins of Pompeii, and so distinctive that they are one of the first things a visitor notices. Each one had a stone counter facing the street, an L-shaped or straight run of masonry faced with fragments of coloured marble, and set into the top of the counter were large round earthenware jars, their mouths flush with the surface, in which food was kept, warm stews and cooked beans and other simple fare, ready to be ladled out to a customer who leaned in from the pavement, paid a coin, ate standing up, or carried the food away. There were, by the count of the archaeologists, something like 150 of these little establishments scattered through the town, which for a town of Pompeii's modest size is a remarkable number, and it tells us something warm and human about the place, that a great many people did not cook at home, that they lived in small rooms without proper kitchens and bought their meals ready, made from the bar on the corner, that the streets in the evening must have been full of the smell of cooking and the low sound of people eating and drinking and talking, exactly as the streets of a lively town are full of those things today. And the walls of Pompeii talked. This is one of the most delightful and unexpected things the town has given us, that its people were forever writing on the walls, scratching and painting messages onto the plastered surfaces of the streets, thousands upon thousands of them, so that the town has come down to us not as a silent ruin, but as a place still murmuring with the voices of ordinary people. Some of it was official, notices of games to be held at the amphitheatre, painted up in bold red letters to advertise the coming gladiators. A great deal of it was electioneering, for Pompeii was a lively little democracy in its local affairs, and at election time the walls filled up with painted slogans urging the voters to support this candidate or that one for the town offices, endorsements from the Fullers' Guild and the bakers and the muleteers and the fruit sellers, and even, tucked here and there, mischievous endorsements clearly meant as jokes, the sleepy drinkers and the late-night revellers loudly urging you to vote for someone, which is the kind of thing that tends to do a candidate more harm than good. And a vast amount of it was purely personal, and it is these scratched private words that reach across the centuries most directly of all, because they are so exactly the things that people write when they think no one important is watching. There are lovers' messages and boasts and insults and complaints, and someone recording that they had a good time here, and someone else lamenting a love gone wrong, and a tired traveller noting that the inn was comfortable, and a small proud scrawl from someone who simply wanted to record that they had been here, that they existed, on this wall, in this town, on this day. And perhaps the most quietly moving of all of them is a short line, scratched somewhere among the thousands, that seems to marvel, in wonder and a little sorrow, that the wall has not long since collapsed under the sheer weight of all the tired nonsense that so many people have scribbled upon it. It is a joke, and it is nearly 2,000 years old, and it is still funny. And the person who scratched it into the plaster could not possibly have imagined that of all the things they might have left behind, it would be that idle little joke that would outlast them, and their town, and their whole world, and come down at last to us, still legible, still human, still exactly the sort of thing a person says, away from the crowded shopping streets, behind the plain and often blank outer walls that faced the road, lay the private houses of the town. And here we come to one of the loveliest surprises of Pompeii, because from the street you would often have no idea what lay within. The Roman town house turned its back on the street. It presented to the outside world a modest, even severe face, a wall broken only by the doorway, and perhaps by a shop or two rented out along the frontage, and it kept all its beauty, all its light and colour and comfort, hidden inside, turned inward around its own private courtyards, so that a grand house was a secret, a quiet green world entered through a single narrow door. Step through that door and down the short entrance passage, and you came into the atrium, the tall central hall that was the heart of the old Roman house, open to the sky in the middle through a wide square opening in the roof, so that light poured down into the room and, when it rained, the rain fell through the opening into a shallow ornamental basin set in the floor directly beneath it to catch it. The atrium was the formal public face of the family, the room where the master of the house received his visitors and his dependents each morning, hung with the images of the ancestors, its floor patterned in mosaic, and beyond it, deeper into the house, lay the truly private rooms, the bedrooms and dining rooms, and, in the finest houses, a second and even more beautiful courtyard, the peristyle. A garden ringed by a covered colonnade of slender columns, planted with flowers and shrubs and shaded trees, cooled by fountains and pools, decorated with statues and marble tables, a private paradise of green and water and quiet at the very centre of the home, where the family could sit in the cool of the evening, screened entirely from the noise and dust of the street. And the walls of these houses were painted, gloriously painted, floor to ceiling, in rich deep colours, a burning red that we still call Pompeian red, and black and gold, and a soft sea green, painted with scenes and scrolls and slender architectural fantasies, with gardens full of birds that seemed to open the solid wall onto an imaginary landscape beyond, with figures from the old myths, with delicate borders and floating cupids and panels of pure glowing colour. It is one of the great gifts of the disaster, terrible as it was, that it preserved these paintings, sealed them away from the light and the air that would otherwise have faded, and destroyed them over the centuries, so that when the houses were opened again the colours were still fresh and deep on the walls, still glowing, and we can stand today in rooms that look, in their decoration, almost exactly as they looked to the family who lived in them on the last quiet evening, and see the very scenes their eyes rested on, and know their taste, and their love of beauty, and the way they wanted their private world to look. The floors were laid in mosaic, tiny cubes of coloured stone set into patterns, some of them of astonishing skill and beauty, great pictures worked out entirely in these little chips of stone, and here and there laid into the floor of an entrance hall, that famous and homely warning to visitors, the picture of a chained dog, teeth bared, and beneath it, in plain letters, the words that anyone can still read, "Beware of the dog." It is such a small joke across the centuries, that picture, so exactly the sort of thing a person might put by their own front door today, and it is one of the countless little moments in Pompeii where the distance between their world and ours simply falls away, and you realise that these were not strange remote figures from a dusty past, but people, ordinary people, who worried about intruders and were proud of their guard dog, and had a sense of humour about putting the two together on the floor by the door. Now Pompeii was not, in the great scheme of the empire, a mighty city. It was a comfortable provincial town of perhaps 10 or 12,000 souls, no more, a place of local importance and local wealth, and it is worth holding on to that ordinariness, because it is the source of so much of Pompeii's power over us. It was not Rome, it was not a capital or a wonder of the world. It was a nice town where nice things were made and sold, and where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, and that is exactly why it matters so much, because the great cities of the ancient world we know mostly from the doings of emperors and generals and philosophers, from the top down, from the grand events recorded by the historians, but Pompeii we know from the bottom up, from the loaves in the oven and the graffiti on the wall and the dog on the floor and the beans in the jar on the bar counter, from the daily texture of ordinary life, as no other place from that whole vanished world has given it to us. It is the town of all towns where we can most nearly walk in and feel that we know the people. And they were a mixed people, all sorts jumbled together, as the people of a busy trading town always are. There were the old wealthy families in their great painted houses, and the merchants and shippers who had made their money in wine and oil and fish sauce and were rising in the world, and the shopkeepers and craftsmen and bakers and fullers and their families, and the labourers and the sailors and carters coming and going through the gates, and, underpinning the whole of it, the vast and largely invisible population of the enslaved, without whom the ancient world could not have functioned at all, the men and women who ground the grain and trod the cloth and carried the water and served in the great houses and did the endless heavy work of the town. It was not a gentle world in that respect. It rested, as the whole ancient world rested, on a foundation of forced labour that we should not romanticize or forget. But it was a human world, full of the whole range of human things, work and rest and worship and pleasure and worry and hope, and on that last ordinary morning every single one of those people, the rich and the poor, the free and the enslaved, the old families and the striving merchants, was going about their business under the same clear sky, in the same warm streets, in the shadow of the same green and patient mountain, with no more idea than anyone else of what the day was going to become. Of all the pleasures of the Roman day, none was more universal or more beloved than the baths, and Pompeii had several sets of public baths, large and handsome buildings where, for a small coin or sometimes for nothing at all, any resident of the town could spend the best part of an afternoon in warmth and comfort and company. The Roman bath was not simply a place to get clean, though it was that too. It was the social heart of ordinary life, the place where friends met and gossip was exchanged and business was quietly done, and the whole town, or at least the male half of it in the afternoon hours, and the female half at other times, came together to soak and steam and scrape and rest. You would arrive and undress in a changing room lined with niches and shelves for your clothes, and then move through a carefully arranged sequence of rooms, each one warmer than the last. There was the cold room, with its plunge pool of cool water for a bracing dip. There was the warm room, gently heated, where the body could adjust and relax. And there was the hot room, the caldarium, close and steamy, with a great basin of hot water at one end and, often, a cold water basin at the other for splashing the face, the air thick with heat and moisture, and the low murmur of voices. And all of this heat, this glorious enveloping warmth, was produced by one of the cleverest pieces of engineering the Romans ever devised, a system so effective that it is hard to improve upon even now. The floors of the heated rooms were raised up on short pillars of brick, leaving a hollow space beneath, and the walls too were built hollow, with flues running up inside them, and a furnace, tended by slaves out of sight at the back of the building, sent its hot gases and smoke flowing through that hollow space beneath the floor and up through the walls, so that the whole room was warmed gently and evenly from below and all around, the very floor warm beneath the bather's feet, the walls warm to the touch, the heat rising and filling the space with no fire and no smoke anywhere in sight. It was central heating, in every real sense, in the 1st century, and it worked so well that you could walk on those heated floors only in wooden-soled sandals to keep from burning your feet. Once thoroughly warmed and sweating, a bather would be scraped clean, for the Romans did not use soap in the way we do, but rubbed the body with oil, and then scraped the oil and the dirt and the sweat away together with a curved metal tool called a strigil, an oddly satisfying sounding process, and then, cleaned and oiled and glowing, would move back through the cooler rooms, perhaps take a final cold plunge, and emerge into the late afternoon relaxed and content, ready for the evening. And the baths of Pompeii were not merely functional, they were beautiful. The finest of them had vaulted ceilings worked in delicate stucco relief, painted walls, mosaic floors, niches holding statues, and pools lined with marble, so that the whole experience took place amid a kind of quiet luxury, warmth and water and art all together, a daily indulgence available to nearly everyone, and it is easy to understand, standing in those rooms even now, why the Romans loved their baths so and built them wherever they went across the whole vast reach of their empire. And near the baths, or scattered about the town, were the other great public pleasures, the theatres. Pompeii had 2 of them, standing side by side in the same quarter of the town, one large and one small, The large theatre was the ordinary sort, a great semicircle of stone seats built into the natural slope of the ground, rising tier on tier open to the sky, capable of holding several thousand spectators, looking down onto a semicircular open space, and, behind it, the raised stage with its tall and ornate architectural backdrop. Here the town watched the plays, the comedies and tragedies and the broad, rude, popular farces that ordinary Romans loved far more than the lofty stuff. And here on a warm evening much of the town would gather, packed shoulder to shoulder on the stone seats, shaded in the heat of the day by great awnings stretched overhead on masts and ropes. A whole crowd of them laughing and jeering and calling out at the players below. And beside it stood the smaller theatre, a jewel of a building, roofed over, more intimate, used for concerts and recitations and more refined entertainments, its seats fewer and its atmosphere more select. Between them, these two theatres tell us again what kind of town this was, a town that valued its pleasures and could afford them, that wanted both the roar of the great open house and the polish of the small roofed one, a town, in short, that knew how to enjoy itself and had the wealth and the leisure to do it. And underlying all of these pleasures, the baths and the theatres alike, was the deep Roman conviction that public life should be comfortable and gracious, that a town should provide its people with fountains and warmth and shade and spectacle, and that a man who had grown rich owed it to his town to spend some of his wealth on such things, to pay for a new set of baths or a rebuilt theatre or a fountain on a corner, and to have his name recorded as the giver. So the wealthy competed to beautify the town, and the town grew ever more comfortable and handsome as a result, and generation after generation of ordinary Pompeians lived out their days amid a level of everyday amenity, of clean water and warm baths and public entertainment and paved streets, that much of the world would not see again for the better part of 2,000 years after the town itself was gone. But of all the entertainments of Pompeii, the one that drew the greatest passion, the one that could fill the whole town with excitement for days beforehand and empty every shop and workshop when the day arrived, was the games at the amphitheatre. The amphitheatre of Pompeii stands in the far corner of the town, tucked into the angle of the old walls, and it is one of the most important buildings in the whole town, not for its size, which is modest, but for its age, because it is the oldest surviving stone amphitheatre anywhere in the entire Roman world, built long before the great Colosseum in Rome, built by two of the town's wealthy magistrates as a gift to their fellow citizens, an oval bowl of stone seats capable of holding, it is thought, the entire population of the town and a good many visitors from the countryside besides, some 20,000 people packed into its rising tiers. Here were held the gladiatorial games, the fights between armed men that the Romans loved, with a passion difficult for us to fully understand, and the hunts and displays of exotic animals, and all the bloody spectacle that was so central to Roman public life. The gladiators themselves lived and trained in the town, in a great colonnaded barracks near the theatres, and they were a world of their own, some of them slaves and prisoners and condemned men fighting because they had no choice, others free men who had chosen the life for the fame and the winnings and the strange, dangerous glamour of it, and the walls of Pompeii are full of them. Painted and scratched and celebrated, the famous fighters named and praised, their victories tallied up, one of them recorded admiringly as the man the girls sighed for, another as the master of his particular weapon, so that we know the gladiators of this one small town by name and reputation in a way we know almost no other ordinary people of the ancient world. And it was at the amphitheatre, in the games, that one of the strangest and best recorded events in all of Pompeii's history took place. An event that reminds us that the passions of the crowd have not changed in the least across all the centuries. In a year some 20 years before the end, in the year 59, there were games held in the Pompeian amphitheatre, and a great crowd came, and among the crowd were many visitors from the neighbouring town of Nuceria, a little way inland, and there was, it seems, already bad blood between the two towns, the ordinary rivalry of neighbours turned sour, and in the heat and the excitement of the spectacle that rivalry boiled over. It began with jeering and insults traded back and forth between the local crowd and the visitors, as such things so often begin, and then the insults gave way to thrown stones, and the thrown stones gave way to drawn weapons, and in a very short time the whole amphitheatre had erupted into a full and murderous riot. Pompeians and Nucerians fighting hand to hand in the stands and spilling out into the streets, and by the time it was over, a number of people lay dead and many more were wounded, most of them among the visiting Nucerians who had come, after all, only to watch some games and had walked into a massacre. And the affair was so serious, so shocking, that it was not dealt with locally, but was referred all the way up to the emperor and the Senate in Rome, who investigated it and handed down a stern punishment. Banning Pompeii from holding any gladiatorial games at all for a period of 10 years, a heavy blow to a town that lived for its spectacles. And, most wonderfully of all, someone in Pompeii painted a picture of the whole event on a wall. A lively crowded scene of the amphitheatre, with little figures fighting in the stands and on the steps and in the open ground outside, the awnings, the outer stairs, the whole shape of the building, and the brawl raging through it all, a kind of ancient news illustration of the town's most infamous day, and it too survived, and we can look at it now and see, drawn by a Pompeian hand, the very moment of the riot that got their town banned from the games. It is such a human story, from beginning to end. Two neighbouring towns that did not like each other, a crowd worked up by spectacle and drink and old grievances, a quarrel that ran out of control, a tragedy, a punishment. And then, unable to resist, somebody painting the whole disgraceful business on a wall to remember it by. There is nothing in it that could not happen between two rival towns or two rival sets of supporters on any weekend now, and that is exactly the point. That is exactly what makes Pompeii so extraordinary. That across 1900 years and the whole vast gulf of a vanished civilization, the people turn out to be so completely, so recognisably, so ordinarily human. They loved their sports and hated their rivals and lost their tempers and did foolish, violent things in crowds and then painted pictures of it afterward, and if you could somehow set one of them down in a stadium today, they would understand exactly what they were looking at, and probably have opinions about it, loudly, within the first 5 minutes. That is the town we are walking through. Not a museum, not a ruin. A living, breathing, quarrelling, laughing, working town, full to the brim with people exactly as alive and as flawed and as dear as anyone alive today. Going about the whole rich business of being human on the shore of that beautiful bay, in the shadow of the mountain, in the last decades before the end. And over all of this daily life, the work and the pleasure and the buying and selling lay the gods, for the Roman world was a world thick with gods, crowded with them, and the people of Pompeii lived every hour of their lives among divine presences, great and small. At the head of the town's religion stood the great gods of the Roman state, worshipped in their temples around the forum. There was Jupiter, king of the gods, in his high temple at the head of the square, and Apollo, in one of the oldest and most beloved temples in the whole town, a sanctuary that reached back to the earliest days, its courtyard ringed with columns, a bronze statue of the god standing ready with his bow. There was Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, who held a special place in Pompeii's heart, for when Sulla planted his colony of veterans in the town he placed it under her protection, and she became the town's own particular patron, so that Pompeii thought of itself as, in a sense, the town of Venus, and built her a great temple looking out toward the sea. And alongside these familiar Roman deities, the town worshipped others who had come from far away, carried in along the trade routes. And chief among these foreign gods was one from Egypt, the goddess Isis, whose worship had spread across the Roman world and taken deep root in the trading towns of the bay, and whose temple in Pompeii was one of the most striking in the town. An exotic and mysterious sanctuary decorated with Egyptian scenes and symbols, where a devoted congregation gathered for rites that promised, more warmly than the cool official religion of the state, a personal closeness to the divine and a hope of life beyond death. The presence of that Egyptian temple, thriving in a small Italian town, tells us again how connected Pompeii was to the whole wide Mediterranean world, how the goods and the people and even the gods of distant lands flowed into it through its little harbour and made their home there. But the deepest religion of Pompeii was not in the great temples at all. It was in the homes. Every house, from the grandest mansion to the poorest set of rooms, had its own small shrine, its lararium, a niche or a little painted cupboard set into the wall, usually near the atrium or the kitchen. And in it dwelt the household gods, the lares and penates, the guardian spirits of the family and the home and the storeroom, painted as small dancing figures or kept as little statues. And before them the family made its daily offerings, a few grains, a little wine, a flower, a whispered prayer, a pinch of incense, the small constant devotions of ordinary people asking the small constant protections of ordinary life, that the food would last, that the family would be well, that the house would be safe. It is a tender thing that household religion so humble and so faithful, going on every single day in every single house in the town, thousands of small flames and small prayers rising each morning, and it is one of the things that make Pompeii feel so intimate, that we can stand in a modest house and see the very shrine where a family prayed each day for the safety of the home, in the last years and the last days before the home was buried. And beyond the walls of the town, along the roads leading out from the gates, lay the dead, for the Romans buried their dead outside the city, lining the approach roads with tombs, so that anyone coming to Pompeii along the main road passed first through a long avenue of the departed, tomb after tomb standing along the roadside, some of them grand and columned, some modest, each one carrying the name of the person within, and often a few words about who they had been, a magistrate, a priestess, a freed slave who had prospered, a beloved wife, and often too an appeal to the passing traveller to pause a moment and remember them, to read the name and so in the reading, to keep the dead a little while longer from being wholly forgotten. The Romans understood, as well as anyone ever has, that to be remembered is a kind of survival, and that to be forgotten is the second and final death, and they built their tombs along the busiest roads precisely so that the living would keep passing by, keep reading, keep remembering. They could not have known, those Pompeians who raised their tombs along the road and asked the passing stranger to remember them, that the whole town, the living and the dead together, was about to be remembered in a way none of them could have imagined or wished for. That far from being forgotten they would become, of all the people who ever lived in the ancient world. Among the very most remembered, their bread and their dogs and their quarrels and their prayers and their painted walls, studied and marvelled at by countless millions of strangers across the centuries. And that the thing that would make them so unforgettable was the very same thing that would, on one ordinary day near the end of summer, take everything from them. For the mountain was almost ready. It had been quiet for so long, so very long, longer than anyone's memory, longer than anyone's grandfather's memory, so long that no one living had any notion that it was a thing that could be anything other than quiet. And yet, deep beneath it, far below the vines and the villages and the busy town, the pressure had been building, patiently, for centuries, and the mountain that had given, and given, and given, was very nearly ready, at last, to ask for something back. There had been a warning, in fact a great and terrible warning, though no one at the time understood it for what it was. Some 17 years before the end, in the year 62, on a winter's day, the ground beneath Pompeii and the whole region around the bay had heaved and shaken in a violent earthquake, a tremendous shock that did enormous damage across the entire district. Buildings cracked and toppled. Temples were shaken to their foundations. Statues fell from their pedestals. Roofs came down, and columns snapped, and the water pipes were broken, and fires broke out. And across Pompeii and the neighbouring towns, a great part of what generations had so patiently built was thrown down in a few dreadful minutes. Flocks of sheep in the fields were killed, it was said, and people were hurt and frightened, and for a time the shock was the only thing anyone could speak of. And here is the thing that we, looking back with all that we now know, can hardly bear, and that they, knowing nothing of what lay ahead, could not possibly have read. That earthquake was the mountains stirring. It was the first great sign, after all the long quiet centuries, that the sleeping pressure far below was on the move at last, that the mountain was waking, slowly, deep in its stony sleep. But no one knew that a mountain could do such a thing, because the mountain had never, in all of living memory or recorded history, done anything at all. To the people of Pompeii, Vesuvius was not a volcano. The word would have meant nothing to them in the way it means something to us. It was simply the mountain, the green and generous mountain, and earthquakes. Well, earthquakes were a known and separate misfortune, a thing that happened from time to time in that part of the world, unpleasant and dangerous, but not, they thought, connected to the peaceful green slopes where the vines grew heavy and the villas stood among their gardens. And so they did the brave and sensible and utterly human thing. They rebuilt. Of course they rebuilt. It was their town, their home, and it had been knocked about, and so they set to work to put it right, and in the years that followed the great earthquake, Pompeii became a town of scaffolding and building sites and half-finished repairs. Everywhere the sound of masons and the smell of fresh plaster, temples being shored up and rebuilt, houses being repaired and, as often as not, improved in the rebuilding, redecorated in the newest fashion, made grander than before. Some of the wealthy, it seems, took the chance to buy up damaged property cheaply and do it up in style. The great public buildings around the Forum were still under repair, some of them right up to the very end 17 years later, still wrapped in scaffolding, still waiting to be finished. Because such things take a long time and money, and there had been more shocks in the intervening years, smaller ones, tremors that came and went, and did a little more damage, and were by now almost a normal part of life, so common that people had stopped paying them much attention. And that is a detail worth resting on, quietly, for a moment, because it is so terribly telling. In the last months and weeks before the end, the tremors grew more frequent. The ground shivered more and more often beneath the town. Wells and springs that had run for generations began, here and there, to dry up or to run strangely. And the people of Pompeii, who had lived with earth tremors for 17 years now, who had rebuilt once and were still rebuilding, took very little notice. They had grown used to it. The ground shook now and then, and it always had lately, and nothing much came of it, and there was work to do and bread to buy and children to raise and a living to make, and you cannot spend your life being frightened of a ground that shivers and then goes still again. So they lived, right up to the last morning, exactly as we would have lived, exactly as we do live, in the comfortable and necessary belief that tomorrow would be very much like today, that the mountain was the mountain, and the town was the town, and the small familiar shivering of the earth was nothing. Nothing at all, just the way of things in that part of the world. And so we come back, at last, to where we began, to that ordinary morning, that quiet, clear morning near the end of the summer, more than 1900 years ago, with the bread going into the ovens and the carts rolling on the paved streets, and the fountains running at the corners, and the woman leaning from her shutter to look at a sky that told her nothing. It is late in the month of August, or perhaps, as some now think, a little later still, in the softening warmth of the autumn, of the year we count as 79. The town is going about its morning. The 81 loaves are in the baker's oven. In 150 little bars the jars are being filled with the day's food. In the great houses the masters are receiving their morning visitors beneath the painted walls, and before 1,000 small shrines the household offerings have been made, the grains and the wine and the whispered prayers for a safe and ordinary day. The mountain stands at the end of every street, green and close and quiet, exactly as it has stood every morning of every life in that town. The sun climbs. The heat begins to gather. It is, in every way that anyone in Pompeii can see, a day like 10,000 days before it, and the whole town, all 10 or 12,000 of them, the rich and the poor, the free and the enslaved, the old and the young, the baker and the fuller, and the gladiator and the priestess, and the child filling a jug at the fountain, every one of them is exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they have always done on the last ordinary morning any of them will ever know. And somewhere around the middle of that day, in the bright warm heart of that perfectly ordinary afternoon, the mountain that had given for 1,000 years finally, and all at once, asked for everything back. We know what happened next with a clarity that we have for almost no other event in the ancient world, and the reason is one of the most remarkable things about the whole story, because there was a witness, a careful and intelligent witness, who watched the whole thing unfold from across the bay, and who wrote it down, years later, in 2 long letters that have survived, so that we can follow the disaster hour by hour through the eyes of a real person who was there. His name was Pliny, and he was a young man at the time, 17 or 18 years old, staying with his uncle at a naval base on the far side of the bay, a good many miles from the mountain, at a place called Misnum. His uncle, an older man of great learning and boundless curiosity, was the commander of the Roman fleet stationed there, and was also one of the most famous scholars of his age, the author of an enormous work gathering together all the natural knowledge of the world. A man who could not see a strange thing in nature without wanting to go and look at it more closely, and it was that very curiosity, in the end, that would cost him his life. On that afternoon, the young Pliny would later write, it was his mother who first noticed it and pointed it out to her brother, the appearance of a cloud, far off, of a most unusual size and shape, rising from somewhere across the bay. The older man, ever the scholar, went out to a place where he could see it better, and what he saw was a great cloud rising into the sky, rising from the direction of the mountain, though from that distance they could not at first be certain which mountain it came from. It rose, the young man wrote, in a way he could only describe by comparing it to a tree, a very tall tree, a pine tree of the Italian kind with a tall bare trunk and a spreading canopy at the top, for the cloud shot up from the earth in a single towering column, straight up to a tremendous height, and then at the top spread outward into wide flat branches, and it was in places bright and in places dark and dirty, stained and blotched according to whether it carried more ash or more of the earth it had torn up in its rising. It was, though no one there had ever seen such a thing or had any word for it, the great eruption column of Vesuvius, blasting straight up out of the shattered top of the mountain to a height of many miles, higher than the highest clouds, a pillar of ash and pumice and superheated gas, driven upward with unimaginable force, spreading out at the top into that vast flat canopy that darkened the sky. And beneath that spreading canopy, directly beneath it, downwind of the mountain, lay Pompeii. For the older Pliny, the scholar, the sight was above all a wonder, a magnificent and unprecedented natural marvel that he simply had to observe more closely, and he ordered a fast boat made ready so that he could sail across for a better look. But before he could set out, a message reached him, a note carried in desperate haste from a woman whose villa lay at the foot of the mountain, directly in the path of the danger, begging to be rescued, for she and many others were now trapped along that stretch of shore with the sea, their only possible escape. And at that the nature of the older man's expedition changed entirely, and here we see the best of him. For the curious scholar became, in an instant, the responsible commander. He gave up his small fast boat and ordered out the great warships of the fleet, the large galleys, and had them launched and put to sea, and he himself went aboard and steered straight for the shore that everyone else was straining to flee, straight toward the mountain, not now to satisfy his curiosity, but to carry help to as many people as the ships could hold. As they drew nearer the mountain, the young man tells us, the ash began to fall on the ships, hotter and thicker the closer they came, and then pumice, the light frothy stones of the eruption, and burnt and blackened fragments, and the sea itself grew shallow and choked with debris, and the shore became impossible to approach where the woman had called from. The helmsman urged him to turn back, but the old commander would not turn back, and uttered, his nephew tells us, the words that have kept his memory alive for 1900 years, that fortune favours the brave, and he ordered the ships on around the danger to another stretch of coast where friends of his had a villa at a place called Stabii, on the far side of the bay from Misenum and much nearer the mountain. And there, at last he landed, and there for the moment we must leave him, the brave old scholar come ashore in the falling ash to comfort his frightened friends. Because the true weight of the story, the heart of it, lies not across the bay at Stabii, but directly beneath that spreading canopy of darkness, in the streets we have walked all night, in Pompeii itself, where the ordinary morning had by now become something for which the people had no name and no understanding and no defence at all. In Pompeii, when the mountain broke open, the first thing was the sound and the shaking, a roar and a shudder, unlike anything in the ordinary run of the frequent tremors. And then, looking up, the people of the town would have seen the thing rising into the sky above them, that impossible column climbing and climbing out of the familiar green mountain at the end of the street, spreading its darkness across the sun. And then, quite soon, the sky began to fall. Not rain, and not the fine drifting ash they might have half expected, but stones, small light stones, the pumice thrown up by the eruption, and now raining back down out of the sky across the whole town. At first a scatter, and then a shower, and then a steady, relentless pelting hail of them, bouncing off the roofs, filling the streets, piling in the gutters and the doorways, coming down without pause, hour after hour. These stones were not at first deadly in themselves. They were light, most of them no bigger than a nut or a small plum, and a single one falling on you would sting but do no great harm. The danger of them was in their endlessness and their weight in the mass, for they did not stop. They kept falling and falling and falling, and they began to pile up, on the streets, in the open courtyards, and above all on the roofs, drifting deeper and deeper across the flat and gently sloping tiles, and pumice, though each stone is light, becomes in a great enough heap a crushing burden. And as the hours passed and the layer on the rooftops grew from a finger's depth to a hand's depth, to knee deep and deeper, the roofs of Pompeii began, one by one, to give way under the load, to sag and crack, and finally to collapse inward with a crash, bringing death down into the houses where people had taken shelter, believing that a roof over their heads was the safest place to be. And this, the collapsing roofs, was the great killer of the first long phase of the disaster. The reason that so many of those who died in that first stage died indoors, buried when the pumice-loaded roof came down. The people faced, through those terrible hours, an impossible choice, and we can read their choices in where their bodies were found. To stay indoors was to risk the roof. To go out into the streets was to face the ceaseless battering rain of stones from the sky. In a darkness that grew, as the hours passed, ever deeper, for the great canopy overhead had blotted out the sun entirely, and the bright afternoon had become a black and choking night at midday, lit only by the flashes and glows from the mountain, and by whatever lamps and torches people carried, an unnatural darkness full of the endless clatter of falling stone and the roar of the mountain and the cries of the frightened. Many, perhaps most, made the wise and human decision to flee, to get out of the town altogether while they still could, and in those first hours a great exodus poured out through the gates and down the roads, people carrying what they could, a bundle of goods, a few coins, a lamp, a treasured possession, a child, streaming away from the town toward the open country and the shore in the hope of escaping the falling sky. And a great many of them made it. This is a thing that is often forgotten about Pompeii, and it matters, so let us say it plainly, and let it be a small comfort in a dark story. Most of the people of Pompeii got out. The eruption did not come without warning in that first phase. It built, over hours, and in those hours the roads were open, and the gates were clear, and the majority of the town, some thousands upon thousands of them, took their chance and fled and lived, and their descendants no doubt walked the earth for centuries after, carrying the memory of the day the mountain broke. It was those who stayed who perished. Some stayed because they were too old, or too young, or too sick to make the journey. Some stayed to guard their homes and their goods. unable to bear the thought of abandoning everything they had, believing, as people in disasters so often believe, that it would surely ease soon, that if they only waited it out under cover, the worst would pass. Some, the enslaved, may have had little choice but to stay where they were told. Some sheltered in cellars and strong rooms that they thought would protect them, and that became, instead, their tombs. And some, tragically, seemed to have fled at first, and then, when a lull came in the falling stone, crept back into the town to see what could be saved, and were caught there when the disaster entered its second and far more terrible phase. For all through that long dark afternoon and into the night, the falling pumice was only the first act. It was frightening, and it was deadly to those it trapped, but it was, in the language of such things, the gentle part, the slow part, the part a person could run from. The true horror, the thing that would end Pompeii utterly and preserve it forever in the same stroke, had not yet begun. It was gathering, up on the mountain, in that towering column of ash and gas that had been holding itself up against the sky for hour after hour on the sheer force of its own upward blast, and which could not, in the nature of things, hold itself up forever. And when at last it faltered, when the great column could no longer sustain its own impossible height and began to fall back down upon the earth, the disaster would change its character entirely, and everything that still lived in the path of the mountain would meet something against which there was no shelter, no distance, and no escape at all. To understand what came next, we have to understand the thing that the people of Pompeii could not possibly have understood, because it was beyond anything in their experience or their imagining, and it is the deadliest weapon a volcano of this kind possesses. When that towering column of ash and gas, held up all those hours by the force of the blast beneath it, finally began to weaken and collapse, the immense mass of hot material at its top did not simply settle gently back to earth. It came down. It fell, a colossal weight of superheated ash and rock and gas, and as it fell it gathered speed and heat and momentum, and when it struck the flank of the mountain it did not stop, but rushed onward, outward, down the slopes and across the land, a boiling, ground-hugging avalanche of scorching gas and ash moving at tremendous speed, hugging the contours of the earth, pouring down and out from the mountain in every direction like a flood. These are what we now call pyroclastic surges and flows, and they are among the most lethal things in all of nature, for they combine three separate horrors into one. They are unimaginably hot, hot enough to kill in an instant. They move faster than any person could ever hope to run, faster than a galloping horse, so fast that there is no outrunning them, and often no time even to understand what is coming. And they are dense with choking ash and gas that fills the lungs and the eyes and smothers whatever the heat has not already killed. There is no sheltering from such a thing. A wall will not stop it. A roof will not stop it. It flows over and around and into everything, filling every street and every room and every hidden cellar with the same searing, suffocating cloud, and it arrives, from the moment it is first seen, in a matter of seconds. This was the death that came for those who had stayed, and the first town to meet it was not Pompeii but its smaller and wealthier neighbour on the other side of the mountain, a lovely little seaside town called Herculaneum, which lay much closer to Vesuvius, tucked right at its foot by the shore, a town of fine houses and rich villas looking out over the water. Herculaneum, by a cruel accident of the wind, had been spared the rain of pumice that buried Pompeii, for the wind that day carried the falling stone away toward Pompeii and left Herculaneum almost clear, so that its people, watching the horror unfold across the mountain, may even have felt for a while that they were the fortunate ones. They were not. When the great column collapsed and the first surges came racing down the mountain, it was Herculaneum, nearest of all, that they reached first, and they reached it in the dead of night, and they engulfed it utterly. The town was struck by a surge of such heat that the effects upon it were quite different from those at Pompeii, and in some ways even more dreadful and more strange. For many years it was believed that the people of Herculaneum had mostly escaped, because so few remains were found within the town itself, and it was thought that they must have fled in time. But then, in more recent decades, the excavators dug down to what had been the ancient shoreline, to a row of stone boat chambers, arched vaults that had opened onto the beach, where boats and gear were stored, and there, crowded into those vaults, they found them. Hundreds of them. The people of Herculaneum, packed together in the arched chambers along the shore, men and women and children, huddled at the very edge of the sea, at the last place the land could take them, waiting, we must suppose, for boats that never came, or for a rescue by sea that the raging water and the falling debris had made impossible. They had fled to the shore, to the boats, to the one road out that a seaside town possesses, and they had gathered there in the dark, hundreds of them together, and there the surge had found them, all at once, and killed them all in a moment, so quickly and so hot that they died where they crouched. Families together, a mother sheltering a child, and were sealed there beneath the flood of ash to be found, together still, 19 centuries later. It is one of the most haunting sights the whole disaster has left us, those crowded vaults along the vanished shore, and it tells us, with terrible clarity, what was now coming, in the same hours of the same night, for the people who still sheltered in the pumice, choked streets of Pompeii, waiting out the darkness, praying to their household gods, believing still, some of them, that if they only held on until morning the worst would surely have passed. For Pompeii, the end came in the small hours of the night and the first grey light of the morning that no longer had a sun. Through the long dark evening the pumice had gone on falling, piling deeper and deeper over the town until it lay a man's height and more across the whole of Pompeii, burying the ground floors, choking the streets, crushing the roofs, and the people who remained had endured it hour after hour in the dark. And then, in the deep of the night, the surges began to reach them. They came in a series, one after another through those last hours, each one racing down from the mountain and out across the buried land, and the earlier ones may have stopped just short of the town or struck only its edges, but they were coming closer with each pulse, and at last, toward morning, a great surge swept down over Pompeii itself and poured through the streets and over the drifts of pumice and into every open space and doorway, and in that moment, whatever still lived in Pompeii died. It was very quick. That is the one mercy in it, and we should hold on to it. For those caught in the surge, death came in seconds, from the heat and the choking cloud, faster than fear could fully form, faster than a prayer could be finished. The people who died in Pompeii in that final hour did not, most of them, suffer long. They were there, and then, almost at once, they were gone, and the ash came down over them and sealed them where they lay. And it is in this final phase that Pompeii received the strange and terrible gift that would set it apart from every other lost place in the world. For the fine ash of the surges, quite unlike the coarse pumice that had fallen before, was soft and dense, and packed itself closely around everything it touched, flowing into every space, moulding itself against every surface, filling every hollow, settling around the bodies of the dead exactly as they had fallen and closing over them completely, and then, in the years and centuries that followed, hardening around them into a solid mass. The bodies themselves, sealed within that hardening ash, slowly decayed away to nothing, as bodies do, leaving behind, held in the hardened ash, a perfect hollow, a void in the exact shape of the person who had died there, down to the folds of their clothing and the expression that the ash had caught. But that is a discovery for much later in our story, and we will come to it, and it is one of the most extraordinary things human beings have ever uncovered. For now, in the greyish dawn after that dreadful night, there was simply silence. When the eruption at last spent itself and the ash stopped falling and the roar of the mountain died away, the sun came back, weak and strange through the murk, and shone down upon a place where a town had been. There was no town. Where Pompeii had stood, on its shelf of grey rock above the bay, there was now only a vast, smooth, grey desert of ash and pumice, featureless, rolling gently, buried many times the height of a person, with here and there perhaps the very top of a tall building still breaking the surface, a fragment of a temple, the crown of a column. But for the rest, nothing. A silent grey plain where 10 or 12,000 people had lived and worked and prayed and quarrelled and loved. A plain so deep and so complete that the very shape of the land was changed, the streets gone, the harbour gone, the river's mouth choked and shifted, the coastline itself pushed out and altered where the debris had filled the sea. The mountain, too, was changed forever. The green and gentle single cone that had stood at the end of every street in Pompeii, that every generation of the town had looked upon without fear, was gone. In its place stood a broken, hollowed, diminished thing, its whole top blown away, ragged against the sky, still smoking, unrecognisable to anyone who had known the old familiar shape. The mountain had spent itself utterly, and in the spending had destroyed not only the towns at its feet, but its own old form, so that even Vesuvius, after that day, was never again the mountain the Pompeians had known. And over the buried town, over the grey and silent plain, the ash slowly cooled, and the strange new landscape settled, and the survivors, those thousands who had fled in time, gathered at a safe distance and looked back across the ruined country toward the place where their homes had been, and saw that there was nothing there to go back to, nothing at all, that the town of Venus, the busy bright town on the shore of the loveliest bay in Italy, had simply ceased, in a single day and night, to exist. And what of the brave old scholar, the fleet commander who had steered his ships toward the mountain to carry help to the people trapped along the shore? We left him coming ashore at Stabiae, across the bay, in the falling ash, and his story, told by his nephew, gives us the disaster from the point of view of one who went toward it rather than away, and it is worth the telling, both for itself and because it shows us how the danger reached even those at some distance from the mountain. When the old man landed at Stabiae, he found his friend there in a state of terror, packing to flee, and the old commander, with a calm that may have been real or may have been kindly assumed for the sake of the frightened household, embraced him and told him to take heart. And then, to show how little he himself was troubled, he asked to be taken to the baths, and bathed, and afterward dined, cheerfully, or with a good show of cheerfulness, while across the bay the mountain burned. He was trying, we may suppose, to steady the people around him by his own composure, and when night fell he even lay down to sleep, and, being a stout old man, slept soundly. His snoring, his nephew tells us with a touch of family humour, audible to those who passed his door. But the danger grew through the night. The courtyard outside his room began to fill with ash and pumice, so deep that had he stayed longer, he might not have been able to get out at all, and he was woken and joined the others, and they debated what to do, whether to stay under the roofs, which were now shaking with the constant tremors and threatening to fall, or to go out into the open under the rain of stones. They chose the open air, tying pillows over their heads with cloths as their only protection against the falling debris, and they went down toward the shore to see whether the sea might yet allow an escape. But the sea was wild and impossible, heaving and contrary, and there was no getting away by water. And there on the shore, in the dreadful dark, the old man's strength at last gave out. He lay down upon a sailcloth that had been spread for him, and called once or twice for water, and drank. And then a wave of something worse came, a smell of sulphur and a rush of flame and fume that sent the others scrambling to their feet and driving onward in flight. And when it had passed and they came back, they found the old scholar lying where they had left him, dead. He had not been crushed, and he had not been burned, for his body, his nephew tells us, was found whole and unmarked, looking more like a man asleep than a man dead, and it seems most likely that the thick foul air, the gas and ash that rolled down even to that further shore, had stopped his breathing, that his stout old body, perhaps already weakened, had simply failed in air that had grown too poisoned to sustain it. So died the great scholar, the most learned man of his age, who had spent his whole life in the patient study of the natural world and its wonders, and who met his end going toward the greatest and most terrible natural wonder any Roman ever saw. Not to gape at it in the end, but to help, to carry his ships toward the people who had cried out for rescue. His body was recovered afterward, when it was safe to return, and his nephew, the young Pliny, who had stayed behind at Misenum and lived, would in time write down everything he had seen and everything he had learned of his uncle's death, in 2 letters to a friend, and it is those 2 letters, the careful account of an intelligent young man who watched a world end from across a bay, that have carried the whole of it down to us across the centuries, the shape of the cloud like a great pine tree, the ash falling on the ships, the words about fortune favouring the brave, the pillows tied over the head, the old man asleep on the shore. Without those 2 letters we would still have Pompeii, the buried town itself, the streets and the houses and the bread in the oven. But we would not have the day, the hour-by-hour human shape of the thing as it happened, the eyes that watched it. It is one of the small miracles that hang about this story, that the greatest disaster of the ancient world happened, by chance within sight of one of the few people with both the presence of mind to observe it clearly and the skill to set it down, and that what he set down survived, so that we can stand today with the young Pliny on the terrace at Misenum and watch, with him, the strange tall cloud climbing into the summer sky above the mountain, and know, as he could not yet know, everything that it meant. The young Pliny himself had stayed behind at Misenum when his uncle sailed, choosing, with the seriousness of a studious young man, to remain with his books. And his account of his own night there, far across the bay from the mountain, tells us how far the terror of that eruption reached, for even at Misenum, many miles from Vesuvius, the night was one of horror. Through the dark hours the earth shook more and more violently, until the tremors were so strong that everything seemed not merely to be shaking, but to be turning over. And the young man and his mother, unable to remain in the house for fear it would come down upon them, went out into the open courtyard and then, as the danger grew, out of the town altogether, joining a great terrified crowd of people streaming away into the countryside in the dark. He describes it with a wonderful and honest eye, the crowd pressing behind them and urging them on, the carts they had brought with them rolling this way, and that on the level ground, though no slope could account for it, so violent was the shaking of the earth, the sea sucked back and drawn away from the shore, so that stranded creatures were left flopping on the dry sand where the water had been, and, on the far horizon toward the mountain, a fearful black cloud, torn by great flashes of fire, breaking open again and again to show long, jagged shapes of flame like lightning but larger. Then the cloud began to come down toward them and to spread across the sea, and it reached the land, and a darkness fell, not the darkness of a moonless night. The young man wrote in one of the most memorable lines of his whole account, but the darkness of a sealed room when the lamp is put out, a total, absolute blackness, and in that blackness he could hear the wailing of the women, and the crying of children, and the shouting of men, some calling for their parents, some for their children, some for their husbands or wives, knowing them only by their voices in the dark, some praying for death out of sheer terror, and many crying out to the gods, and more, he says, believing that there were no gods any longer at all, and that this darkness was the last night of the world falling forever. Ash fell on them there too, and they had to keep rising and shaking it off or be buried where they sat, and the young man confesses, with a plain honesty that makes him very dear to us across the centuries, that he took some small comfort, some grim consolation, in the belief that he was perishing along with the whole world, and not alone. But the world did not end. At last, far off, the blackness thinned to a kind of smoky twilight, and then the real daylight returned, weak and yellow and strange, and the sun came out, ghastly, the young man says, the way it looks in an eclipse, and they looked around them and saw everything changed and buried under ash, deep drifts of it lying over the whole land like snow, the familiar country made unrecognizable, but they themselves alive. And so the young Pliny and his mother lived, and returned to Misenum, and waited in anxiety and grief for news of the old man who had sailed toward the mountain, until at last the word came back of how he had died on the shore at Stabiae. and years later, a grown man now, and a distinguished one, the young Pliny would take up his pen at the request of a friend, the great historian of the age, who wished to set the disaster down accurately for the record, and he would write out these 2 long letters, one of his uncle's death and one of his own night of terror, apologizing, in the modest way of such men, that he could offer only what he himself had seen and heard, and warning his friend to use only what seemed worth using. He could not have known, that modest, careful, honest man, that of everything he ever wrote in a long and busy public life, it would be these 2 private letters, this eyewitness account of a single dreadful night, that would carry his name down through all the centuries after, and would give to the whole future of the world its one true window onto the day the mountain broke. We owe him a great deal, the young Pliny. Because of him, Pompeii is not only a silent ruin, but a story with a shape and a voice and an hour and a human face, and every person who has ever stood in those excavated streets and tried to imagine the day has stood, whether they knew it or not, beside a serious young man on a terrace far across the bay, watching a cloud shaped like a great pine tree climb into the sky, and beginning, without yet understanding, to remember. In the days and weeks after the eruption, some of the survivors did come back, picking their way across the strange grey desert that had swallowed their homes, and here and there, where the top of a tall building still stood proud of the ash, they dug down, tunnelling into the buried town to try to recover what they could, the valuables left behind in the flight, the marble and the bronze, the statues and the fittings of the great houses, and the archaeologists have found the traces of this digging, the rough holes punched through walls, the rooms stripped of their finest things, and even, scratched here and there onto a wall by one of these sad returning scavengers, a few despairing words, in one place a scrawl that seems to lament that the town, that Pompeii, was now nothing. And then, having taken what could be taken, the survivors went away and did not come back, and the town was left to the silence and the ash. And here begins the strangest chapter of all, the long chapter of forgetting. For the truly remarkable thing is not only that Pompeii was buried, but that it was, in time, so completely forgotten that even its location was lost. That a busy town of 10,000 people could be so thoroughly erased from the surface of the earth that the very ground where it lay became, within a few generations, simply a stretch of country with an old name and no memory attached to it. The emperor of the day sent aid to the stricken region and considered what might be done, but there was no rebuilding a town buried many times the height of a man beneath rock-hard ash, and so the survivors were resettled elsewhere, and the great grey scar in the landscape was left alone, and slowly, as such places do, it began to heal in the only way it could, from the top down. The rain fell on the ash, and the wind carried in dust and seeds, and grass took root in the surface, and then shrubs, and then trees, and the volcanic ash, being what it was, proved in time as fertile as the old soil it had buried, so that within a century or two the whole area was green again, farmed again. Planted with the very vines and orchards that had grown there before, the roots reaching down, all unknowing, toward the buried rooftops of a town that no one now remembered was there. People lived on the surface, farmed the ground, built farmhouses, walked the fields, generation after generation, directly above the sealed and silent streets, and had no idea at all, that beneath their feet, beneath the roots of their vines, lay a whole town, perfect and complete and full of the dead, waiting in the dark. The name lingered, faintly, in a corruption of the old word, attached to a district and a hill, so that the memory of Pompeii was not entirely gone, but the knowledge of what and where it truly was faded away and was lost, and the old accounts of the eruption, the letters of the young Pliny among them, survived here and there in libraries, and were read now and then by scholars. But no one connected the words on the page with any particular patch of green Italian countryside, and for something like 1,500 years, for the better part of a millennium and a half, Pompeii lay entirely lost, a town remembered only as a story, its true body hidden so well that the world forgot it had a body at all. Empires rose and fell above it, The great Roman world of which it had been a comfortable provincial corner grew old and sickened and finally collapsed, and new peoples came, and new kingdoms formed, and new faiths spread across the land, and the long ages that we call the medieval centuries came and went, castles and cathedrals rising and falling, and through all of it, through all those hundreds upon hundreds of years, Pompeii slept on beneath its blanket of fertile ash, undisturbed, its painted walls glowing in the dark, its bread still in the oven, its dog still curled by the door, its dead still lying where the surge had taken them, in a silence so deep and so complete that it is almost holy to think of, 15 centuries of silence, while the world that had forgotten the town went on forgetting, and lived, and farmed, and slept above the roofs of the sleeping town, and never once suspected what lay so close beneath. And it might have slept there yet, for all we know, had not the curiosity that killed the old scholar, that same restless human need to dig and to look and to know, at last turned its attention, quite by accident, to a certain green hillside near the bay, and put a spade into the ground, and struck, in the dark beneath the vines, the top of a buried wall. The rediscovery, when it came slowly and half by chance, in the way of such things. Over the centuries there had been hints, the odd fragment turned up by a farmer's plough, the occasional coin or piece of marble, a well dug down that struck old worked stone, and once, long before, the cutting of an underground channel to carry water had passed straight through the buried town and turned up inscribed stones and painted walls, but no one had understood what they were seeing, and the hints had been ignored or forgotten. It was not until a little under 300 years ago, in the middle of the 1700s, that the buried towns were found again in earnest and understood for what they were. It began not at Pompeii but at its neighbour Herculaneum, where workmen digging a well-struck ancient marble deep underground, and word reached the king who then ruled that part of Italy, a king with a taste for antiquities and a fine new palace to fill with them. And he set his men to digging down after the marble, tunnelling deep into the hard-packed volcanic rock that covered Herculaneum, and they brought up statues and columns and treasures, and the fame of it spread and the hunt was on. And a few years later, the diggers turned their attention to another site a little way off, where old walls and paintings were being found nearer the surface. Easier to reach, and this site, though they did not at first realise it, was Pompeii, buried under softer and shallower material than Herculaneum, and so far more easily uncovered. And here, over the years that followed, the diggers began to bring the lost town back into the light. It was not, in those first generations, anything we would now recognise as careful archaeology. It was closer to treasure hunting, a royal treasure hunt, driven by the desire to fill the palace and the new museum with beautiful and valuable things, statues and paintings and fine objects to be cut from the walls and carried away. And the diggers tunnelled and burrowed and took what was precious and portable, and too often destroyed or discarded or reburied what was not thought worthy. Keeping. Painted walls were hacked into to remove the best central panels, and the rest left to ruin. Whole houses were emptied of their treasures and filled in again. There was little record kept, little thought given to where a thing had been found or what it had lain beside, and much that could never be replaced was lost in the very act of discovery. And yet, for all its roughness and its greed, that early digging did something that could never be undone. It proved that the old story was true. It showed the world that Pompeii was real, that beneath the vines and the fields there lay a whole Roman town, not a ruin worn down by time and weather like the tired old monuments that stood above ground elsewhere, but a town caught whole. A town where the paint was still bright on the walls and the loaves were still in the ovens, and the shape of daily life was preserved as it was preserved nowhere else on earth. And that revelation struck the imagination of the age like a thunderclap. For here was the ancient world, not as a heap of broken columns or a passage in a dusty book, but alive, immediate, complete. A Roman town you could walk into and through, and the effect of it on the taste and the art and the dreams of the time was enormous, sending a wave of fascination with the classical past rolling across the whole of educated Europe, sending travellers and scholars and artists flocking to the bay to see the wonder for themselves, to walk the freshly opened streets, to stand in the painted rooms, to feel the strange and thrilling nearness of a world 2,000 years gone. Pompeii, lost so utterly for 15 centuries, forgotten so completely that even its grave was unmarked, had come back, and the world would never again be able to forget it, and the poor scavenging survivor who had scratched on a wall that Pompeii was now nothing had been, in the deepest sense, exactly wrong. For the town was about to become one of the most visited, most studied, most cherished places in the entire history of the human race. For a long time the digging went on in that rough and greedy way, more plunder than study, and it was not until a little more than 150 years ago that Pompeii found the man who would at last treat it as it deserved, a scholar who took charge of the excavations and transformed them utterly, and whose name deserves to be remembered alongside the town he saved from its own rescuers. He was an Italian archaeologist, and he came to the work with a wholly new idea of what it was for. It was not, he insisted, a hunt for treasures to fill a museum. It was the careful, patient, systematic recovery of a whole town and a whole way of life, and everything mattered, not only the statues and the gold, but the humble things. The pots and the tools and the bones and the very layers of the ash itself, and everything was to be recorded, measured, mapped, left where it made sense to leave it, understood in its place. He organised the town into regions and blocks and numbered every house so that any find could be recorded exactly where it lay. He began, for the first time, to dig from the top down, uncovering the buildings from their roofs downward as they had been buried, rather than tunnelling in from the side, so that the town could be understood whole and left standing. He worked to keep what was found in place, so that a visitor could see a house as a house, and not as an emptied shell. He brought method and care and respect to a place that had known little of any of the three, and modern archaeology in a real sense was born in the streets of Pompeii under his hand. But of all the things this careful scholar gave to Pompeii and to the world, one stands so far above the rest, one single brilliant insight, that it has come to define the town in the imagination of everyone who has ever heard of it. He had noticed, as others had noticed before him without understanding it, that as the diggers worked through the hardened ash of that final deadly surge, they would now and then break into a hollow space, a void in the solid material, and that sometimes at the bottom of these voids there were bones. And he understood where others had not what these hollows were. They were the spaces left by the bodies of the dead. The fine ash had packed itself around each person in that final hour, sealing them in and then hardening, and the bodies within had rotted away to bone over the centuries, leaving behind a perfect mould, a hollow in the exact shape of the human being who had died there, holding every detail that the ash had touched, the drape of a garment, the shape of a hand, the very features of a face, the posture of the last living moment. And so he devised a method of astonishing simplicity and power. When his workers found such a void, they would stop and carefully drill a small hole into it and pour in liquid plaster and let it flow into every part of the hollow and set hard, filling the space that the body had left. And then, when the plaster had cured, they would chip away the surrounding ash and lift out, into the light of day, a plaster figure, a cast in the exact shape of a person who had died in that spot 1800 years before. And what came out of the ground, when they did this, stopped the world in its tracks, and stops it still. For these were not statues, not idealized marble gods with blank and perfect faces. These were people, ordinary people, caught in the last instant of their lives. And every attitude of that last instant was there, exact and undeniable and heartbreakingly human. Here was a person lying on their side, drawn up, one arm raised as if to shield the face from the burning air. Here were people fallen together, close, a larger figure curved protectively around a smaller one. Here was someone who seemed to have pulled a fold of cloth up over the mouth against the ash and the fumes, the gesture frozen forever in the plaster. Here was a person sitting, head bowed into the hands. And, most famous of all, here was a dog, a household dog that had been left chained in a courtyard when its people fled, twisting on its back against the chain in its last struggle. Its collar still shaped in the plaster, an animal's last moment made permanent, and impossible to look at without a catch in the throat. These casts changed everything, because they took Pompeii, which had been a marvel of streets and paintings and pots, a wonder of things, and they made it, suddenly and forever, a matter of people. You cannot look at the casts and think of Pompeii as ancient history, as a dry chapter from a schoolbook. You look at them and you see a mother and a child. You see fear and love and the instinct to shield another body with your own, and the plain animal terror of the end, and you understand, with a force that no words and no dry account could ever carry, that these were living human beings exactly as alive as you are, that they woke that morning with plans for the afternoon, and that the whole of their world ended around them in a few hours, and that this shape in the plaster, curled and shielding and afraid, is what was left. It is almost unbearable, and it is also, in a strange way, one of the most precious things the human race possesses, because it will not let us forget, will not let us turn the dead of Pompeii into a statistic or a date, insists, across all the centuries, on their absolute and individual humanity. And so the work has gone on, generation after generation down to our own day, patient and careful and never quite finished. For Pompeii is a very large town, and even now, after nearly 3 centuries of digging, a good part of it, perhaps a third, still lies unexcavated beneath the ground, deliberately left buried, held in reserve for the future, for the archaeologists yet to come who will have tools and methods and questions that we cannot yet imagine, and who will surely understand what they uncover far better than we could. There is a wisdom in that restraint, in leaving something in the ground, that the early treasure hunters would never have understood, the humble recognition that to dig a thing up is in part to begin to destroy it, that everything exposed to the air and the light and the rain begins at once to decay, and that the buried town has kept its secrets so perfectly for so long, precisely because it was left alone, and that perhaps the kindest thing the present can do for the past is to take only what it can properly care for and leave the rest sleeping. For that is the great and quiet lesson that runs underneath everything Pompeii has to teach, the strange double truth at the heart of it. The very same disaster that destroyed the town is the only reason we have it. Had Vesuvius never broken open on that late summer day, Pompeii would have gone on living, and growing and changing, and would in time have grown old and been rebuilt and rebuilt again, and worn down and perhaps dwindled and been abandoned or absorbed, in the ordinary way of towns, until nothing of the first-century town remained but a few worn stones, and we would know it no better than we know 1,000 other ancient towns whose names are half remembered and whose daily life is lost to us forever. It was the catastrophe that saved it. The ash that killed the people is the ash that kept the bread in the oven and the paint on the walls and the shape of a mother's arm around her child. The mountain that took everything from Pompeii in a single day gave it, in exchange, the one thing no other town of the ancient world was given, which was to be stopped, whole and complete and utterly ordinary, in a single moment, and kept that way, sealed and perfect, until a later age was ready to open it and to learn from it what daily human life in that vanished world had truly been. And what it has taught us is beyond price. Almost everything we know of the small texture of Roman daily life, the way ordinary people cooked and ate and shopped and worked and washed and worshipped and amused themselves and wrote on walls and buried their dead and loved their children and complained about their neighbours, we know in large part because of this one buried town and its buried neighbour along the shore. The great histories of the age tell us of emperors and wars and the doings of the mighty. Pompeii tells us of the baker and the fuller and the bar on the corner, of the dog on the doorstep and the election poster on the wall and the loaf scored into segments for breaking, of the shrine in the corner where a family prayed each morning, of the exact red they liked to paint their walls and the jokes they scratched into the plaster and the beloved gladiators whose names the girls sighed over. It gives us not the history of the Roman world, but the life of it, the ordinary, daily, human life of it. and it gives us that life not as a reconstruction or a guess, but as a thing preserved, real, touchable, still there. And it gives us too, in the plaster shapes of its dead, the deepest and simplest lesson of all, the one that needs no learning and no scholarship, which is that these were people, only people, exactly like us, and that everything that fills our own days, the work and the worry and the small pleasures and the love of the people close to us, filled theirs too, and mattered to them exactly as much as ours matters to us, and that all of it can be, and one day will be, gathered up and carried away, and that this is not a reason for despair, but a reason to hold the ordinary day gently, and to love it while it is here. And what of the mountain itself in all the long years since? For Vesuvius did not fall quiet forever after it destroyed the towns at its feet. It is not a dead thing, spent and finished. It is a living volcano, one of the most closely watched in all the world, and across the centuries, since the great eruption, it has stirred and woken and broken open again and again, many times over, in a long, slow rhythm of sleep and waking that continues to this very day. There have been other eruptions, some of them large and terrible in their own right, that have poured lava down the ancient slopes and buried farms and villages and sent ash drifting across the bay. And there was one, a few hundred years ago, that killed thousands and reshaped the mountain once more. And there have been many smaller stirrings, glows in the night and plumes of smoke and rivers of slow red lava, watched with awe by the people who have always, in spite of everything, continued to live around it. And that is perhaps the most astonishing thing of all, more astonishing even than the burial or the rediscovery, that people came back, that they always come back. For the very same soil, the deep, rich, fatal generosity of the volcanic earth went on being the most fertile ground in Italy, and the very same bay went on being one of the loveliest and most useful curves of coast in the whole Mediterranean, and so, generation after generation, in full knowledge now of exactly what the mountain can do. Having the buried towns dug up and displayed before their very eyes as a warning written in plaster and stone, people have gone on building their homes on the slopes of Vesuvius and along the shore at its feet, planting the vines again, raising the towns again. Until today, the region around the mountain is not empty and shunned, but is one of the most crowded and densely peopled places in all of Europe, a great sprawling modern city and its suburbs pressing right up around the base of the volcano, hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of people living, right now, tonight, as you listen, in the shadow of the mountain that once did to Pompeii what it did. It is easy at first to think this foolish, and the scientists who study the mountain will tell you frankly that it is dangerous, that Vesuvius is only sleeping and not dead, that it will certainly one day wake again, and that when it does, the getting of so many people to safety in time will be one of the hardest problems any city has ever faced. And yet there is something in it too that is not foolish at all, but deeply and stubbornly human, this refusal to abandon a beautiful and generous place because it is also a dangerous one. This willingness to live alongside the mountain, to take its gifts and accept its risks, to plant the vine in the shadow of the volcano and trust, as people have always trusted, that the worst will not come in one's own short lifetime, that there will be time enough, that tomorrow will be like today. It is exactly the same trust that the people of the 1st century Pompeii lived by, the same easy confidence that let them look at the green mountain at the end of every street without a flicker of fear. And it turns out that 1800 years and a museum full of plaster casts have not changed the human heart in this respect in the slightest. That we are, all of us, still perfectly willing to build our homes on the slopes of the sleeping mountain. Because the ground is rich, and the view is fine, and the danger is far off, and the day is warm. And because, in the end, some mountain or other sleeps beneath every life that was ever lived, and the only real choice is whether to spend the borrowed peaceful years in fear of the waking or in love of the warmth. The people of Pompeii chose the warmth. So, it seems, do we. And the mountain, for now, sleeps on above the sleeping town and the waking city both. green again on its lower slopes where the vines have climbed back up toward the ragged summit, quiet again, patient again, gathering itself again in the slow and unhurried way of mountains, for a morning that has not yet come. If you were to go there now, to the excavated town, and walk into it through one of the old gates, you would find something that no other ruin on earth can offer, which is not a scattering of broken monuments, but a town, a real town, that you can walk through street by street. You would step onto the same paved roads, worn with the same deep cart ruts, and step across the same raised stepping stones the Pompeians laid to keep their feet dry, and pass the same fountains at the same corners, and look up the same streets to see, at the end of them, the same green mountain, quiet again, standing where it has always stood. You could walk into the houses, through the modest street doors and down the entrance passages into the tall atriums open to the sky, and stand in rooms where the paint still glows red and gold on the walls, and look at the mosaics still set into the floors, and read, if you have the Latin, the warning about the dog by the door. You could go into the great forum and stand in the open square with the broken columns around you and the temple of Jupiter at its head and Vesuvius filling the sky beyond, exactly as a Pompeian stood there to buy fish or argue about an election 2,000 years ago. You could sit on the stone seats of the great theatre, or stand in the oval of the oldest amphitheatre in the world, where the riot with the neighbouring town once spilled blood down the steps. You could see the bakeries with their millstones and ovens, and the bars with their counters and their sunken jars, and the baths with their hollow floors, and the tombs along the road outside the gate with the names of the dead still legible upon them, asking, still, to be remembered. And now, at last, richly answered, for they are remembered by the millions who come each year and pause and read the names. And you could stand before the plaster casts of the dead, kept now in the town they died in, and be quiet for a while. It is one of the most visited places on the entire earth, Pompeii, and for all that the crowds can be great and the day can be hot, there is nowhere quite like it for the strange soft collapse of time that happens there, the sudden vanishing of the 2,000 years that are supposed to lie between, so that a person walking those streets in the low golden light of a late afternoon, when many of the visitors have gone, can feel, with a force that is almost frightening and almost sweet, how very thin the wall really is between their world and ours, how nearly you could turn a corner and find the town simply going about its evening. And the caring for it is never done, for a town dug up out of the protecting earth is a fragile thing, and the sun and the rain and the frost and the roots and the sheer press of feet all work slowly at it, and walls that stood buried and safe for centuries have, in the open air, cracked and slumped and sometimes fallen, and so there is a constant patient labour of shoring and roofing and mending and guarding, a long quiet effort by many hands to hold the town a little longer against the weathering it suffers now that it is no longer sleeping safe beneath the ash. There is something moving in that too, in the great and continuing care that the present takes of this fragment of the past, the money and the skill and the love poured out year after year simply to keep the old town standing, to keep the paint on the walls and the stones in the streets, so that the people who come after us may also walk in, and also feel the wall between the ages grow thin, and also stand quiet before the plaster shapes of the dead. It is a way of keeping a promise, that care, a promise made across an enormous gulf of time to people who never knew us and could not have dreamed of us, the promise carved on their own roadside tombs, the oldest and simplest human plea there is, the plea to be remembered. And we are keeping it. Of all the towns that ever were, this one small, comfortable provincial town on the shore of a lovely bay, this town of bakers and fullers and fish sauce and painted walls, is remembered as almost no other place has ever been remembered, and will go on being remembered, as long, very nearly, as there are people left to remember anything at all. And Pompeii, we should remember, was not alone in its fate, was not the only place the mountain took that day, but only the largest and most famous of a whole buried world, a whole vanished stretch of that beautiful coast, sealed all together in the same hours beneath the same ash. There was Herculaneum, the smaller, richer town along the shore, buried far more deeply and far more thoroughly, so deep and so hard-packed that even now only a part of it has been reached, and it has given up treasures of its own quite different from Pompeii's, for the intense heat and the deep sealing of Herculaneum preserved things that rotted away entirely at Pompeii. The actual wood of doors and beds and shelves and stairs, carbonized black but whole, so that in Herculaneum you can see the very furniture of a Roman house, a wooden cradle still standing where a baby once slept, a wooden screen, a set of shelves, the charred beams of an upper floor. And most wonderful of all, in one great seaside villa at Herculaneum, the diggers found a library, an actual library of the ancient world, hundreds upon hundreds of scrolls, the rolled papyrus books of a Roman gentleman's collection, carbonized by the heat into fragile black cylinders, so charred and so delicate that for a long time they could not be opened at all without crumbling them to dust. And only now, in our own time, with the newest and most delicate instruments and the patient cleverness of many minds, are we beginning to read them again without unrolling them, to peer inside the blackened rolls and coax out the ancient words, the only library to survive whole from the entire classical world, still giving up, 2,000 years later, texts that no living person has read since the day the mountain broke, and scattered along the buried coast were the great country villas of the wealthy grand seaside pleasure houses, with their gardens and their colonnades and their sea views, some of them since uncovered, with painted rooms as fine as any in Pompeii, and there were the smaller farms and country houses of the working countryside too. One of them found with the tools of the wine harvest still in it, and the presses and the great buried jars, caught in the middle of the ordinary agricultural year. So it was not one town, but a whole living landscape that was sealed that day. A whole cross-section of the Roman world, from the rich man's library, to the farmer's wine press, to the baker's oven, to the household shrine. All of it stopped at once, all of it kept. And it is the sum of all these buried places together, the towns and the villas and the farms, that has given us our unmatched window onto how that world actually lived. And it is the small things, in the end, even more than the grand ones, that reach us most. Not the temples and the statues, fine as they are, but the little intimate objects of daily life that the ash preserved, the things that are so exactly like our own things that they close the whole distance of the centuries in a single glance. A child's wooden toy, a set of surgeon's instruments, the scalpels and probes and forceps, so like the ones a doctor uses now that the purpose of each is plain at once. A woman's jewellery, the rings and earrings and bracelets, left on a table or still on the bones of a hand. A game with its counters, abandoned mid-play. The carbonized remains of a last meal, eggs and fish and nuts and fruit, the very food someone was about to eat. A loaf of bread with the baker's stamp still pressed into it, a dog's collar, a coin dropped in the street, a garden even, brought back to life, for the archaeologists learned in time to find the hollows left in the ash by the roots of the vanished plants, and to cast them as they cast the bodies, and so to discover exactly what had grown in a Pompeian garden, which trees, which flowers, which vegetables, and to plant those very gardens again, in the very beds, so that in some corners of the town the roses and the vines grow now exactly where and exactly what they grew before, in the same soil, in the same shade of the same walls, a garden replanted across 2,000 years from the memory of its own roots. There is no end to the intimacy of it, and no bottom to the strange tenderness it stirs, this endless recovery of the small dear ordinary things of a single ordinary day, and it is the reason that Pompeii, of all the wonders of the ancient world, is the one that people love, not merely admire but genuinely love, the way you can only love something that feels, against all reason and all the weight of the centuries, like home. There is a question that people sometimes ask, softly, when they have stood in Pompeii for a while and felt all of this, and it is worth answering gently before we let the story go, because it is really the deepest question the town raises. Is it right, they wonder, to look? Is there not something uneasy in it, in the crowds filing past the plaster shapes of people who died in terror, in the studying and the photographing and the marvelling at what was, after all, the worst day of thousands of real lives? It is a fair thing to wonder, and the wondering does us credit, for it means we have not turned the dead into mere objects, but still feel them as people. And the answer, I think, the answer that the town itself seems to give, is that to remember is not the same as to intrude, and that there is a way of looking that is not idle curiosity, but something closer to reverence, something closer to keeping faith. The people of Pompeii, remember, lined their roads with tombs and begged the passing stranger to pause and read their names and so keep them from being forgotten. They understood, better than we often do, that being remembered is a gift the living can give the dead, perhaps the only gift, and that to be truly forgotten, to vanish utterly from all memory, is the one loss beyond all repair. And so when we come to Pompeii and walk its streets and stand quiet before its dead, and carry away in ourselves the knowledge of who they were and how they lived and how they died, we are not intruding upon them. We are answering them. We are doing the very thing they asked of the stranger on the road, on a scale they could never have imagined, keeping their names and their faces and their ordinary precious lives alive in the memory of a world that would otherwise never have known that they existed at all. The baker who set his loaves to bake that morning is remembered. The family that curled together in the dark is remembered. The dog left chained in the courtyard is remembered. The person who scratched a joke into a wall about the weight of all the nonsense scratched into walls is remembered and is still, all these centuries later, making strangers smile. That is not a small thing. That is, perhaps, as close to a victory over death as human beings can come. And Pompeii, the town that was so utterly destroyed, is the town that has won that victory more completely than any other place that ever was. And so the destruction turns, in the end, into something that is almost, if you look at it long enough and gently enough, a kind of strange grace. Not the suffering, which was real and terrible and should never be prettied over or explained away, but what came of it, what has been made of it, the way the very catastrophe that ended so many lives has kept those lives from the deeper oblivion that swallows nearly everyone who has ever lived, the countless billions of ordinary people across all the ages whose names and faces and daily doings are gone forever, utterly gone, as if they had never been. Most of the human beings who have ever lived are forgotten completely, and that is simply the way of things, the vast silent forgetting that is the fate of nearly all of us. But not the people of Pompeii. By the strangest of chances, by the cruelest and then the kindest of turns, one ordinary afternoon in one ordinary town was lifted up out of that great forgetting and set apart and preserved and made to speak, for all the countless ordinary days that were never preserved and never spoke, so that when we stand in Pompeii we are standing, in a way, in the presence of all of it, all the lost ordinary life of all the vanished world, given back to us in this one place, this one town, this one long ago afternoon that the ash reached out and kept. It is worth remembering too, as our long walk through this old town comes gently toward its close, how ordinary Pompeii was, how thoroughly unremarkable before the mountain made it immortal. It was not a capital, not a wonder, not a place the great historians of its own day thought worth much notice. It was a nice enough provincial town, one of a great many such towns scattered across the vast body of the empire, no more important in the grand story of Rome than 100 others. A comfortable, prosperous, ordinary place that would have been entirely forgotten, in the ordinary course of things, exactly as its 100 sister towns have been entirely forgotten, their streets ploughed under, their names half lost, their daily life a blank. And that, when you sit with it, is the most extraordinary thought of all. That what Pompeii gives us, what makes it a treasure beyond all price, is precisely its ordinariness, precisely the fact that it was nothing special, that it was just a town where people lived. We do not go to Pompeii to see the achievements of the mighty. We go to see the daily life of the unremarkable, the same daily life that was being lived at that very moment in 1,000 other towns that left no trace. The same bread, the same water, the same shops and shrines and quarrels and jokes. The whole vast ordinary business of human living that fills nearly every life and is preserved in almost none. Pompeii is the one place where the ordinary was saved, and so it stands for all the rest, for all the unsaved ordinary lives of all the unsaved ordinary towns, a single preserved specimen of the thing that actually makes up the greater part of all human existence, which is not war and empire and the doings of kings, but the quiet daily round of ordinary people in ordinary places, doing ordinary things, and loving their children, and worrying about money, and looking forward to dinner, and glancing up now and then at the mountain at the end of the street without a thought in the world. There is a line, an old and lovely line, that says that history does not really vanish, that it does not disappear, but only sinks down and becomes the ground beneath our feet, the soil we stand on, the foundation we build our own lives upon without ever quite seeing it. And nowhere is that truer, more literally and more tenderly true, than at Pompeii, where the past is quite exactly the ground beneath the feet, where for 15 centuries people farmed and lived and slept directly above a whole buried world without knowing it was there, and where even now a good part of the town still lies under the green fields, still sleeping, still waiting, the roofs of it a little way beneath the roots of the vines. The past is always there, just below us, holding us up. Pompeii only makes visible what is true everywhere, that we live our short bright days on top of the deep accumulated silence of everyone who came before, that the ground beneath every town and every field and every road is thick with vanished lives, that we walk always on the roofs of the forgotten. And there is nothing frightening in that when you hold it gently in the quiet of the night. There is something rather that steadies a person, that settles the heart in the knowledge of how many have come before, how many ordinary days have been lived and loved and lost, how the whole enormous patient procession of ordinary human life has gone on, age after age, each generation waking to its own ordinary mornings and its own bread and its own small worries, and passing on, and sinking down at last into the kind ground to become the foundation of the next, in a great slow rhythm as old and as calm and as sure as the sleeping and the waking of the mountain itself. So let us go back one last time, before we let the night take us, to that ordinary morning where we began, and let us hold it gently, and let it be, for as long as we like, simply what it was, a good morning in a good town. Picture the light first, the soft grey light before the sun is fully up, filling the narrow streets between the high plastered walls, and the coolness of the air that will not last past mid-morning, the pleasant early coolness that the woman at the shutter breathed when she leaned out to look at the sky. Picture the fountains at the corners, running and running, the water sliding over the worn stone lip and catching the first light, and the sound of them, that low, endless liquid murmur that filled every street of the town all day and all night, so constant that no one heard it any more, the sound of a town that never ran short of water. Picture the smell of the first bread, warm and yeasty, moving down the lane from the baker's open door, and the 81 loaves scored into their neat segments, sliding into the round brick oven on the long wooden paddle, and the baker straightening his back and wiping his hands, thinking of nothing at all but the ordinary work of the day. Picture the carts beginning to move on the paved roads, their wheels dropping into the smooth-worn ruts, and the first shopkeepers folding back their wooden shutters, and the jars on the bar counters being filled with the day's warm food, and the household shrines receiving their morning grains and their whispered prayers in 1,000 quiet houses. Picture the great houses waking, the light pouring down through the open roofs into the tall atriums and falling on the painted walls, red and gold and sea green, on the gardens in their colonnaded courts, where the fountains played among the roses and the little birds came down to the water. Picture the dog stretching in the doorway over the mosaic that asked visitors to beware of him, and the child carrying the heavy jug home from the fountain with both arms wrapped around it, and the old men making their slow way toward the forum, and the whole bright ordinary town coming awake around them, 10,000 people and more, each one of them the centre of a whole world of their own, each one with a past and a family and a set of small plans for the day, all of them together making up the warm living body of the town. And picture, at the end of every street, framed against the pale morning sky, the mountain, green and gentle and close, wooded near the top, planted with vines below, the same soft blue-green it had always been, standing quietly over the waking town exactly as it had stood over every morning of every life that town had ever held. Giving no sign, asking nothing, simply there, as familiar and as unregarded as the sky. Hold that picture. Do not hurry past it. That morning was real. Those people were real as you. Lying here now in the dark, listening, they woke to that light and breathed that cool air and smelled that bread. And for them, it was not the last morning of a doomed town, not a famous tragedy, not a chapter in any book. It was only Tuesday. It was only an ordinary good day beginning, the kind of ordinary good day that is the truest treasure any of us is ever given, and that we so rarely notice we are holding until it is gone. Let that be the gift the old town gives you tonight, across all the centuries, from its quiet buried streets. Not fear of the mountain, only a little more love for the ordinary morning, the running water and the warm bread and the light in the street and the people you love still sleeping down the hall, the whole quiet, unremarkable miracle of an ordinary day held gently while it is here. And if you are still with me, still drifting somewhere along the edge of sleep, let the whole long story wash over you now one more time, softly, the way water washes over stone, not as facts to be held, but as pictures to be let go. Let the first people come again to the shelf of grey rock above the river, the old Oskans with their rough local tongue, drawn to the good soil and the safe high ground and the little harbour. 5 small villages leaning toward each other across the slow generations until they touched and became one town with one name. Let the Greeks come again in their ships from across the sea, bringing their letters and their gods and their painted cups and their love of the theatre, and the Etruscans pressing down from the north, and the Samnites coming down out of their mountains to take the town, and to stay, and to build the great walls all around it, and lay out the straight paved streets. Let Rome come, patient and hungry, and the long wars and the siege, and the veterans planted in the town until it was Roman through and through, Latin in the streets and Roman in the law, and let the town grow rich, slowly, century by century, on its wine and its oil and its grain and its famous fish sauce, the wealth flowing in through the little harbour and settling in the town, and building the fountains and the temples and the baths. Let the water run again through the buried pipes to 100 street corners, free to anyone with a jug. Let the bakers grind their grain and heat their ovens, and the fullers tread their cloth, and the little bars on every corner ladle out warm food to people leaning in from the pavement. And the walls fill up again with painted notices and election slogans and lovers' messages and idle jokes. Let the great houses turn their backs on the street and open inward onto their tall, bright atriums and their green colonnaded gardens, the painted walls glowing red and gold, the fountains playing among the roses, the little dog on the mosaic by the door. Let the crowds fill the baths in the warm afternoons, moving through the cold room and the warm room and the hot room, scraped and oiled and content, and let them pack the great theatre under its awnings and the oldest amphitheatre in the world, roaring for the gladiators whose names the girls sighed over. Let the household shrines receive their morning grains, and the tombs stand along the roads with the names of the dead upon them, asking the passing stranger to remember. Let the earthquake come and be rebuilt, and the tremors come and be ignored, and the wells run strange and be shrugged away, and the town go on, comfortable and confident and entirely unafraid, right up to the last ordinary morning. And then let the mountain rise, and the tall cloud climb like a great pine tree into the summer sky, and the stones fall, and the darkness come down over the streets, and the people flee down the open roads in their thousands and live, or shelter under their roofs and wait, and let the young man far across the bay watch it all and write it down, and then let the ash come and cover everything, and the silence come and last 1,500 years, and the vines grow green again over the sleeping roofs, and then, at last, let the spade go into the ground and strike the top of a buried wall, and the long slow waking begin. The town coming back street by street and room by room into the light, the paint still bright. The bread still in the oven, the dog still curled by the door, and the plaster poured at last into the hollows of the dead to give them back their shapes, and the millions coming, year after year, to walk the old streets and stand quiet and remember. Let all of it move through you now, gently, and then let it go. All of it, the peoples and the walls and the water and the wine and the fire and the ash and the long silence and the waking, let it all sink down softly like the ash itself settling, like the town settling into its long sleep, like you settling, now, into yours. There is no hurry now. There is nowhere else to be and nothing left to do, and the whole of the old town is quiet. And the whole of the night is quiet, and you may let yourself grow as heavy and as still as the stones in the buried streets. Think, if it helps you drift, of how long the town slept, undisturbed, under its deep warm blanket of ash, 15 centuries of perfect rest, while the whole loud world went on turning far above it, empires rising and falling, wars and harvests and winters and springs, and none of it reaching down into the deep-sealed quiet where the town lay dreaming, safe and whole and utterly at peace, in a silence deeper than any silence you have ever known. There is a kind of comfort in that, in the thought of so complete a rest, so long a stillness, and you may borrow a little of it now for yourself, may let yourself sink down toward that same deep quiet, out of the reach of the loud world and its cares, down where nothing can disturb you and there is nothing at all that needs doing. The tremors that shook the town are long stilled, the falling stones have long since fallen, the fires are long cold. Everything that was ever going to happen to Pompeii has already happened, thousands of years ago, and there is nothing left in the whole long story that can trouble you now, no suspense, no danger, no dread, only the quiet town in the quiet ground under the quiet mountain, resting as you are resting, in the deep and gentle dark. Let your breathing slow. Let it grow soft and even, like the slow settling of ash through still air, like the slow drift of mist along a buried street. Let each breath out carry a little more of the day away from you, a little more of the weight, a little more of whatever you are still holding, until there is nothing left to hold and nothing left to carry, and you are simply here, warm and still and safe, in the dark, at the end of the long story. The mountain sleeps, the town sleeps, the dead are remembered, and at peace. The vines grow green over the sleeping roofs, and the water still runs, somewhere over the worn stone lip of an old fountain, that low endless murmur that filled the town for all the centuries of its life. Running still, running softly, running you down into sleep. And you are drifting now, further and further from the shore of the waking day, out onto the deep calm water of the night, where the story cannot follow, and the mountain cannot reach, and there is nothing at all but the soft dark and the slow breath and the deep, deep quiet of a town that has been sleeping for 2,000 years, and is sleeping still. And should some small part of you still be turning, still be awake enough to wonder or to worry, let that part rest too, for there is nothing in this old story that asks anything of you tonight. You do not have to remember the names, or the dates, or the order of the peoples, or which mountain the cloud rose from, or how the baker scored his bread. It does not matter in the least whether you carry away a single fact of any of it. The story was never for learning. It was only ever a long, soft, winding path for you to walk down until you fell asleep somewhere along the way, and if you have already half fallen, then the story has done exactly what it was for, and you may let the rest of it go entirely. May let the words become just a sound. A low, steady murmur in the dark, like the sound of the fountains in the old streets, meaning nothing now, asking nothing, only keeping you gentle company as you sink the rest of the way down. Everyone in the story is at peace. The people of the town, who woke to their ordinary morning so long ago, have long since finished their long day and taken their long rest, and are remembered now, and honoured and safe forever from the deep forgetting, and there is nothing left to grieve. The old scholar who sailed toward the mountain to help is remembered for his courage. The young man who watched from across the bay is remembered for his careful, honest words. The town itself, so utterly lost, is found and cared for and loved, and will go on being loved long after this night is over and you have woken to your own ordinary morning and forgotten every word of this. All of it is well. All of it is finished and at peace, 2,000 years finished, and the knowing of that can be a pillow under your head, soft and cool and easy. That whatever troubled the day is such a small and passing thing set against the great slow patient turning of all those centuries, the rising and the falling, the sleeping and the waking, the ordinary mornings beyond all counting that have come and gone and will come again, each one a small bright treasure, each one held for a little while and then let go, in the long kind rhythm that carries all of us, the people of the old town and you and everyone you love, gently on and gently down and gently home. So rest now. Let the last of the story dissolve into the dark. Let the mountain be quiet, and the town be quiet, and your own thoughts be quiet, one after another growing still, like lamps going out along a street at the end of the night, one and then another, until the whole long street is dark and soft and still, and there is only you, and the warm dark, and the slow sweet weight of sleep coming down over you at last, as kindly and as completely as the ash came down, all those years ago, over the sleeping town. Are you still awake? If you are, then know that it is perfectly all right, and that there is nothing you need to do but lie still and breathe, and let the quiet hold you, and sleep will come in its own good time, the way the morning always came to the old town, without your having to reach for it at all. And if you are drifting, if my voice is growing far away and soft, and the words are running together into a gentle blur, then simply let go, and let yourself slip down the rest of the way into the dark, and do not fight it, and do not come back. There is another story waiting for you, just there, on the screen, whenever you are ready for it. Another long, slow walk through another old and gentle place, ready to carry you down into sleep on another night. But not now. Now there is only rest. If these quiet nights are of some use to you, if this long, slow way of telling the old stories helps you find your way down into sleep, then it would mean a great deal to me if you would gently like this video, and subscribe, and stay a while, but only, always, only, if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you have not yet done so, and if your eyes are not already closed, leave your town and your local time down in the comments before you go, so that another sleepless soul, somewhere far away in the dark, scrolling for something soft to carry them off, might find their way here and settle in beside you and be helped a little too. Thank you for spending this long, quiet night with me, and with the old town on the shore of the lovely bay, in the shadow of the sleeping mountain. It has been a gift to walk it with you. And now there is nothing more to see, and nothing more to do, and nowhere at all you need to be but here, warm and still and safe in the gentle dark, at the end of the long, long story. So let the lamp grow dim, let your breathing slow, let the whole world soften and grow quiet, and fall away. Close your eyes now, and let go, and rest. Good night, and sweet dreams.